I am Curran Bhatia, and welcome to the Ask the Experts podcast. Today I'm breaking down the historic Anthony Joshua versus Andy Ruiz heavyweight fight. I'll give you my analysis, along with the interviews I've conducted with experts in the field who bring their own unique perspective to this unexpected and unforgettable event. But before that, let's quickly look back at what transpired on June 1st, 2019 in Madison Square Garden.
Anthony Joshua is the total package. I mean, almost a cartoon character. This is how you would draw up the heavyweight champion if you were dreaming it up. He's 29 years old, 6'6", chiseled at just under 248 pounds. Andy Ruiz Jr. is not the body beautiful, 6'2", 268, and again, a significant athletic advantage and a significant reach advantage as well for the heavyweight champion, Anthony Joshua. Ruiz mixes it up. Good uppercut and a hook. Puts Ruiz down. Wow, that was fast from Joshua.
5, 6, 7. More than 2 minutes to go in this round. Anthony Joshua is a composed and ferocious finisher. Watch this.
21 knockouts in 21 wins for Anthony Joshua. Ruiz comes to fire back.
And Joshua's hurt.
Oh, Joshua goes down.
Andy Ruiz caught him with a sharp left hook. Joshua's hurt.
But what an answer by Ruiz. There is 40-plus seconds left in this round.
These are the most important 40 seconds of Andy Ruiz's career. He has a hurt champion in front of him.
Joshua is hurt. He's staggered, and he goes down again. That's a knockdown. Joshua's been down twice.
Joshua looks gassed. Mouthpiece came flying out of his mouth. Joshua looks so tired. I think he wants out.
That's it. He says that's it. Andy Ruiz is the heavyweight champion.
My name is Curran Bhatia, and we are going to break down the heavyweight fight for the ages. Anthony Joshua versus Andy Ruiz. It was the dramatic, historic upset. So what exactly happened on June 1st? Somehow, Andy Ruiz got up from the canvas, and it deserves to be dissected, and we have just the people to do it. I have assembled an incredible group of guests. I'll be speaking with Thomas Hauser. He is one of the preeminent boxing authors of our time. I'll be talking to Mike Coppinger of The Athletic. I'll be chatting with Kelefa Sanneh of The New Yorker. I interviewed the ringside doctor who actually worked the fight. That and many more people who were there and people well known in boxing circles. But before that, let's get to the fight. There's a saying in boxing, speed kills. In other words, the guy with the fast hands is dangerous. Forget everything else, that is what matters. Before this fight, Anthony Joshua was the heavyweight champion. He was undefeated, he was charismatic, he was knocking everyone out. And he was supposed to fight Jarrell Big Baby Miller. This was going to be Joshua's first fight outside of the UK. He was fighting in Madison Square Garden in America, and Big Baby Miller tested positive for PED. So they wanted to bring in another opponent. They wanted someone American because this fight was in America, and they found someone who was actually Mexican-American in Andy Ruiz, and he fought in Mexican style, which definitely surprised Anthony Joshua and eventually led to the upset, which we'll get into. No one gave Ruiz a chance, and a huge part of that is because the way he looks. He doesn't look like a fighter. He has a big belly. It's a little sloppy looking. And Anthony Joshua, in comparison, is 6'6". He's chiseled like a statue. Ruiz was listed at 6'2". I stood next to him at the pre-fight events, at the weigh-in. He looked closer to 5'11" to me. It was almost comical at these events to see these two guys standing next to each other. They didn't look like they should be fighting. But since the fight, training footage has emerged of Ruiz. He's a hard worker. He can move like a big man, and obviously he showed you what he could do on June 1st. So why does he look the way he does if he trains that hard? It could be genetics. The most likely reason is what he said. He eats Snickers and steak before every fight, so who knows exactly what his diet is. The bigger question is why he has not been sponsored by Snickers yet. We need to figure that out. So in case you missed the fight, this is what happened. Round 3. It started off the way we expect it to go. That's something the great Emmanuel Stewart used to say. Joshua lands a combination, lands a left hook, drops Ruiz. This is what we all thought would happen. But what happened next is the opposite of what anyone could have imagined. Ruiz took a second, he got up, and he fought back. He took another huge right hand from Joshua, he ate it and moved forward, and he landed a combination of his own and landed a massive left hook to the temple of Joshua, which took out Joshua's equilibrium, caused him to go down. It was absolutely shocking. Everyone in the arena, including myself, our jaws were dropped to the floor. Now, there was a little bit of thought, hey, is this a fluke? Did this actually just happen? Well, then Ruiz did not let up. And with 40 seconds left in the round, you heard Sergio Mora say, this is the most important 40 seconds of Andy Ruiz's career. I'll go a step further and say it was the most important 40 seconds of his life, and I think he genuinely capitalized on that. He landed another flurry to Joshua's head and knocked him down again for the second time in that third round. And this is where everyone in the arena is looking at each other saying, wow, is Andy Ruiz really going to win this fight and be the new heavyweight champion? Fast forward to the 7th round, Ruiz knocks down Joshua for a third time. Joshua gets up, he kind of smiles at Ruiz. It was weird, he may have had a concussion, it was odd behavior. Ruiz comes in again, lands another combination. Joshua goes down for the 4th time. This time he loses his mouthpiece. He gets up. He turns his back to the ref. He goes to his corner and he turns around to the ref. The ref says, "Are you okay?" Joshua says yes, but his body language doesn't look good. He looks disinterested. He almost looks like he doesn't want to be there. And the referee stops the fight. And we have Andy Ruiz as our new heavyweight champion. We'll get into what exactly this upset means, where its place is in history. We have a lot of good guests to talk about that. The one thing I want to say before that is that there was people on Twitter, prominent sports personalities, saying, oh, this is a disgrace, no more Wilder Joshua, and I actually completely disagree. The story here is not anything like this was a disgrace or Joshua didn't train hard enough or took this guy lightly, even though those things may be true. What the story is here is that Andy Ruiz was on the canvas and he decided to get up, impose his will on Anthony Joshua, and he deserves 1,000% of the credit for that. And Wilder Joshua could still happen, but there's now a 4th player in that top realm of heavyweights, of elite heavyweights. You have Deontay Wilder, you have Tyson Fury, you have Anthony Joshua, and now you have Andy Ruiz. Any one of those guys fighting each other would be a great matchup. You cannot disqualify Andy Ruiz. You cannot take anything away from him just because he has an imperfect body. The way he looks doesn't take away from the fact that he had 105 amateur wins and only 5 losses. His body doesn't disqualify him from having a nearly undefeated record. He had one very close fight against Joseph Parker, which he lost in Parker's hometown. That was a razor-thin decision, and many people thought Ruiz won that fight. Nothing that Andy Ruiz has accomplished, including what happened on June 1st, is erased by the fact that he is not seemingly in shape by the way he looks. To me, it's pretty simple, and it goes back to another upset we had many years ago. It was at a much lower level, a much smaller scale event, but James Kirkland at the time was undefeated, and he took on Nobuhiro Ishida from Japan, who was virtually unknown in America. And the great Jim Lampley was calling that fight. Nobuhiro Ishida knocked down Kirkland 3 times and eventually took him out all in the first round. And Jim Lampley said, Kirkland's getting badly out-techniqued by Nobuhiro Ishida, who looks utterly fearless. And this isn't the profile that most Kirkland opponents possess. And it is the exact same thing on June 1st. Joshua got out-techniqued by Ruiz, and this isn't consistent with the profile of many of Joshua's opponents. Obviously, the great Vladimir Klitschko was not of that profile either. He had a great life and death fight with Anthony Joshua. Bottom line, Ruiz has been fighting since he was a kid, and it was that muscle memory that got him this win. You go back to what you know when you're in trouble. Anthony Joshua didn't start fighting until he was 18. He may not have experienced the same type of adversity. He may not have had to come back from situations like this enough of the time. He did it against Klitschko, but maybe not in the past. Maybe he hasn't done it enough. And let's talk about matchups. I actually think Wilder versus Joshua sometime in the future is more likely to happen, and I'll tell you why. Joshua no longer has that O next to his name. There may be less pride involved. And now you have Deontay Wilder going against Tyson Fury early next year. That's a close fight that we don't know how it will end. Last time around, Wilder landed a massive right hand in the 12th round. Fury was down for 9.9 seconds. He barely got up, and that fight was a draw. But Wilder could certainly lose that too. And even if he doesn't, the dynamics have shifted, and it is more likely that these big fights can get made, especially depending on what happens with that Wilder-Fury fight. Joshua and Ruiz are going to rematch most likely in November of this year. That is going to be a massive event, and I actually think Joshua can come back stronger from this. I think he can fight more defensively. He really opened up in that 3rd round after knocking down Ruiz, and he may want to take a more tactical defensive approach. Other heavyweight champions have done this after losing, like Vladimir Klitschko, Lennox Lewis, and others. It really is a great time for the sport. It's a great time in the heavyweight division. Wilder versus Fury will be for the WBC belt, which Wilder holds, the Lineal Championship, which Tyson Fury holds. Ruiz now holds the other 3 belts. Eventually, if the winners of these 2 fights fight, it would be for all 4 heavyweight belts and the Lineal Championship. That would be the first time that has happened in the modern 4-belt era. Like I said, it is a great time in heavyweight boxing and boxing in general, and the fight that happened on June 1st between Anthony Joshua and Andy Ruiz deserves to be dissected. We need to break it down. We need to talk to the experts because it was one of the most historic and crazy nights of boxing that we've ever had, and I have assembled the team to discuss it with. First up, I'll have Thomas Hauser. Like I said, he is the preeminent boxing author. He's written The Black Lights. He's written about Muhammad Ali. You've heard his name. You've seen his writing. And now you're going to get a chance to hear his take on what happened between Joshua and Ruiz. Next, I have Mike Coppinger. He has been breaking all the boxing news, and he's now working at The Athletic. After that, I'll be speaking to Kelefa Sanneh. He's a staff writer for The New Yorker and a boxing historian who has a great take on this fight and this event. Then I'll be speaking to Dr. Nitin Sethi. He was the ringside physician for this fight, and he has a very unique perspective on boxing in general and how to make the sport safer. I'll be talking to Evan Rutkowski. He is of the Fistianados podcast. He breaks down the business aspect of this. How does this upset change the subscriber numbers for The Zone? What's going to happen? I'll be chatting with Dave Harmon. He was the producer for The Zone. He was in the TV truck. How do you cover a big fight like this for the audience? What do you do differently? We're going to find that out. I'll be talking to Dan Canobbio. He's an announcer and works for CompuBox. They track statistics. It turns out Joshua was trending to be more defensive. He was throwing less power punches in his last 10 fights. How did that affect him against Andy Ruiz? We'll talk to Dan about that. I'll be speaking with Ed Mulholland. He was the official ringside photographer for the fight. He was right up against the ropes. He's taken photos at some of the biggest fights of all time. He photographed Gotti Ward. Where does he place Joshua Ruiz in everything that he's covered? I'll be talking to Lee Groves. If you know who Lee Groves is, he is an absolute boxing encyclopedia. He can break it down almost better than anyone else, and he's going to give us everything to think about in terms of how we place this fight in history. And I'll be talking to Corey Erdman. He was in the arena as well. He's going to give us his take of what it was like to be there. So without further ado, let's get to the first guest. I am Curran Bhatia, and let's ask the experts. I am speaking to Thomas Hauser. He is one of the most accomplished authors and historians in boxing. He wrote The Black Lights. He's written numerous books about Muhammad Ali, and he's nice enough to give us some time and give us some insight looking back at the big heavyweight fight, Anthony Joshua versus Andy Ruiz. Thomas, before we get into the fight itself, I was just wondering your perception and your feeling about Anthony Joshua. Did you think that he was one of these once in a generation type heavyweights like a Muhammad Ali or a Mike Tyson? You know, he's charismatic. He has the big smile on his face. He's always talking with people. He's friendly, and he's obviously a hard worker and was undefeated before this fight. Did you see him as one of those type of once in a generation heavyweights?
Anthony Joshua was marketed as a rock star. He has a lot of charisma. As best I can tell, he's a very nice man. He's a good fighter, but he was never Godzilla. You know, you have to put this upset in context. Is it an upset? Absolutely. But it's not Mike Tyson and Buster Douglas, because Mike Tyson was the heavyweight champion of the world. It's not Cassius Clay and Sonny Liston. Sonny Liston was the heavyweight champion of the world. After those fights occurred, you had a new heavyweight champion. Andy Ruiz beat Anthony Joshua, and people are saying, well, no, maybe he's the number 3 heavyweight behind Deontay Wilder and Tyson Fury, both of whom would be favored over Andy. And Anthony Joshua will be favored over Andy if they fight again. So it was a huge upset. Obviously, it meant a great deal in the United Kingdom, where Joshua is enormously popular. But you have to keep it in context. This was not a changing of the guard. This was one of 3 men who claimed the heavyweight crown getting beaten.
In that third round, Joshua knocks down Ruiz. That's what most of us thought would happen. What most of us didn't think would happen is Ruiz, he actually took his time. He took a second, and then he got up, and he ended up landing a big left hook behind Joshua's ear, knocked off his equilibrium, knocked him down quickly, and then knocked him down again in that round. My question is, in a big fight scenario like that, have you ever seen something like that where a guy goes down and so quickly gets up and knocks down his opponent in a big scenario?
Well, didn't Vladimir Klitschko come back from a knockdown and then knock Anthony Joshua down?
He did a round later, yeah.
Wasn't that the scenario of that fight? And Tony Ayala getting knocked down, getting up, and coming in for the kill immediately afterwards. It was a good punch by Joshua, and what people tend to forget was after he knocked him down, he whacked Ruiz with another good right hand right after that. But it was a two-punch combination that knocked him down, if I saw it correctly. He hit him with a right uppercut, then the left hook put Ruiz down. Ruiz got up, but Ruiz was not stunned. He might have been a little shaken, but he had his faculties about him the whole time. Andy takes a good punch.
When that seventh round happened and Ruiz knocked down Joshua twice, the referee waved off the fight. I was just curious to your thoughts on this stoppage. Did you think it was at all early? The referee asked Joshua if he was okay. Joshua said he was, but the referee didn't seem to like his body language. I just wanted to know, A, did you think it was a fair stoppage? And also just the psychology now that will go into Anthony Joshua. He's lost his undefeated record, and moving forward, what you think that how that's going to affect him moving forward.
First, I don't think it was a premature stoppage. Mike Griffin is a very good referee. Anthony was not competitive anymore. His own promoter, Eddie Hearn, says it was a good stoppage. What he did was save Joshua from taking quite a bit of unnecessary punishment by stopping it at that point in time. In terms of going forward, we don't know. There are fighters like Evander Holyfield who got knocked out, and it didn't change them. They come back stronger than ever. Joe Louis was knocked out by Max Schmeling the first time they fought. We all know what happened the second time around there. And then there are other fighters who never recover from it. Take somebody like Michael Grant, who was knocked down by Andrew Galata, actually, got up, survived that fight because Galata quit before Michael could. But Michael was never the same fighter again. He got whacked out by Lennox Lewis, became easier and easier to knock him down. So you really don't know. But these people who are writing, Anthony Joshua off because he lost one fight, that's ridiculous. That doesn't happen in other sports. I remember a fighter who got knocked out by a journeyman named Ross Purity. Then he got knocked out by a glorified club fighter named Corey Sanders. And then after that, he got knocked out by Layman Brewster. That's 3 bad knockouts. And that guy was Vladimir Klitschko, who came back to have a pretty good championship reign after that. So let's not write Anthony Joshua off prematurely. Let's see what he does going forward.
And just looking ahead, the Joshua-Ruiz rematch will most likely happen this fall. We know Wilder-Fury 2 will most likely happen early next year. There's now 4 players, main players in this space instead of 3. And if one day the winners of each of those 2 fights come together, it would be for all 4 of the major belts plus the lineal championship. So my question for you is, in a scenario of looking ahead, who do you think, when the dust settles, who do you think will come out on top in terms of those 4 guys as the heavyweight of this generation?
Okay, first, I think you're optimistic in thinking that all these fights are going to happen. Joshua Ruiz will probably happen in the fall, but we don't know for sure that it will. And yes, there has been talk that Wilder and Fury has been signed, but we don't know that will happen. And then we don't know if the 2 winners will fight each other because you have the same problems going forward that you had before in making those fights. And now that Joshua has lost, There'll be a lot of talk from the Wilder or Fury side. Well, you don't have the same negotiating leverage. We're going to give you less. So I don't know that that's going to happen. Right now, we don't have a heavyweight champion, or we have three of them, which is a little like having three kings of England. My feeling is if you fought a round robin, which is the best way to really do this, if you were going to say if each of these four guys, because you have to put Ruiz in the mix now, if each of these guys fought the other three, my sense is that Deontay Wilder would finish in first place. Deontay is a very flawed fighter, as we know, but he has learned how to use his height and reach very well to protect his chin. He can whack, and my sense is that right now Deontay is the best fighter, best heavyweight in the world, but he's got to prove it in the ring. Whether or not he will choose to and have the opportunity to prove himself in the ring remains to be seen.
And just to wrap it up, looking back at Joshua Ruiz, you mentioned the other upsets in boxing history and where you think this ranks. Just in terms of the shock value of all, Ruiz was a late opponent. He replaced Big Baby Miller, and he obviously has the body type that he does, which made it seem visually even that it would be even more of a challenge for him to do that. Just for the shock value of it, and the fact that it was such an interesting fight that got such mainstream attention. I just was curious, all the fights that you've covered in your time, where do you rate it in terms of the shock value and the mainstream attention being given to it?
Hard to say. Obviously, Mike Tyson losing to Buster Douglas had much greater shock value. There are other fights all along the way, and then you have to ask yourself, well, are we only looking at major fights where there have been upsets, or are we looking at lesser-known fighters? Even something as basic as Ray Leonard beating Marvin Hagler was a shock to a lot of people. One of the few good things, actually, there aren't many, but one of the few good things about mismatches is that occasionally we're wrong and the sacrificial lamb rises up and slays the butcher, and that's what happened here. So it's enough to say it's a huge upset, but, people are fickle. The same people who a couple of weeks ago were saying this is a terrible mismatch, this is awful, they're saying, Joshua shouldn't fight Ruiz again, the same thing will happen. Get over it. It's a fist fight. People can lose. Bob Arum is running around saying, well, this is terrible if they fight again. There's no way Joshua can beat Ruiz. Bob Arum was, so he's very smart. I don't mean to say he's not smart. He's a brilliant man. But let's not forget Bob Arum released Andy Ruiz from a promotional contract last year. So, is it a big upset? Yes. Was it a fun fight? Yes. To me, the first danger sign for Joshua in that fight wasn't the third round when he got knocked down. It was the first two rounds of that fight when he did absolutely nothing, and Ruiz was actually moving forward and pushing Anthony Joshua back behind not very much. And Anthony can't fight going backwards. Very few heavyweights can. So if I'm Joshua, before I even look at the third round of that fight, I look at the first two rounds, and I ask myself, why was I so ineffectual in those first two rounds? You got to solve that riddle before you move to the next one.
That's very interesting. I don't think many people were talking about the first two rounds, and I do think that Joshua will have to go back and try to change his style a little bit. He's been trending from going from power punches to working the jab more, and he probably has to do that a little bit more, be more defensive, and do that for the rematch. Other heavyweights have done that in the past and made that switch. We will see what happens. Thomas Hauser, thank you so much for giving your expertise and placing this fight in history. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
The great Thomas Hauser giving us his take and perspective on Anthony Joshua versus Andy Ruiz. Interesting to note that he believes Deontay Wilder will actually come out on top when all is said and done in the heavyweight division in this era. All right, up next, I have Mike Coppinger, aka Sources. You've seen him breaking news on Twitter, and now he's writing for The Athletic. We're going to get his perspective right now. Mike, we just had a historic fight between Anthony Joshua and Andy Ruiz. It was a crazy upset. What are your initial impressions?
Just one of the most surreal moments I've ever experienced live at a fight. Everyone, including myself, knew that Andy Ruiz was good. He wasn't some guy picked off the street, even though he was a very replacement. We knew he was good, but no one I knew gave him any much of a chance, let alone picked him to bring the upset. And to see such a titan of the sport like Anthony Joshua toppled like that in such dramatic fashion, it was just like we couldn't believe our eyes. People were jumping up and down. Everyone's mouth was aghast. One of the craziest moments I've ever experienced.
Before the fight happened, we all looked at Andy Ruiz. We looked at his body type. We didn't really look at his body of work. We didn't look at the 105 amateur wins. We didn't look at the nearly undefeated record. We didn't take into account the hand speed that he had. Before the fight, what did you think? Did you think Ruiz had a chance?
Not at all. I thought Joshua would knock him out mid-rounds. I knew Andy Ruiz, had certain skills like fast hands and a good combination puncher, and I knew he was tough. But I think all of us, at least myself, when we saw Anthony Joshua drop Andy Ruiz with that hellacious left hook in round 3, we thought, all right, well, this is going exactly as planned. And, it took only a minute for Andy Ruiz to prove that he wasn't there to just be walked over, dropped Joshua twice, and the rest is history.
There were reports that Anthony Joshua had a panic attack before the fight, something he's denied. But every single one of his fights was in the UK. This time he was in a vastly different time zone. His schedule was different. He may have been out of his element. Do those type of things play a factor into what happened, or was it simply that Andy Ruiz came to win the heavyweight championship and he wouldn't take no for an answer?
We'll definitely know better about that when we see the rematch, whether it's, Anthony Ruiz is simply just an underrated fighter, if Joshua was an overrated fighter, a little bit of both possibly. I don't really buy the pressure aspect as far as panic attacks go. Sure, it is a lot harder fighting away from home and having to adjust to new media demands and, like you said, a different time zone. But we're talking about a guy here who's headlines outdoor stadiums like Wembley Stadium and places in Cardiff, like the Millennium Stadium, in front of 90,000 outdoors. I just don't see him being a moment being too big for Anthony Joshua. I think Andy Ruiz, let's not forget, punch placement played a big factor in this fight. Ruiz hit Joshua in the temple, right behind the left ear. That's an equilibrium shot. That can really mess up your balance for the remainder of the fight. We've seen it before.
In the 7th round, Andy Ruiz dropped Anthony Joshua, as we know. Joshua went down. He gets up. He kind of smiles at Ruiz. And then Joshua gets dropped again by Ruiz. This time his mouthpiece comes flying out. He turns his back to the referee. His body language wasn't good in terms of someone who wants to keep fighting. Did Joshua quit there? And was it a good stoppage? Just take us through the end of the fight.
Definitely a great stoppage, because after that second knockdown, Joshua had both his arms draped over the ropes. He was looking at his corner. He clearly had no desire to continue. And you see him looking over at his cornerman. He wanted out for sure. I don't want to say he quit, because these guys are punching each other in the head. And Joshua, I don't know how hurt he was, if he was concussed. So it's a dangerous sport. So if anyone thinks they can't continue, that's fine with me. I definitely did not think he had any problem with the stoppage. I thought he was kind of like feigning outrage to save face. And I know everyone's been critical of his demeanor and attitude following the stoppage, but, he's probably embarrassed. He's a guy who was his big U.S. debut. He wasn't expected to have any trouble. He's this Adonis that gets knocked out by this unassuming, fighter with not the most impressive physique, obviously. And I think he's embarrassed for sure.
When you look at this fight in terms of the massive upset that it was, the names Tyson Douglas come up, Louis Rahman come up. Where do you rank this fight in terms of being an upset?
Definitely can't say it approaches Tyson Douglas, which I still consider the greatest upset in sports history. Douglas was a 42-1 underdog, and Mike Tyson was Mike Tyson. No one ever thought Anthony Joshua was invincible. We've seen him hurt in fights against Alexander Povetkin and even against Dillian White. We knew that he had problems with his chin. We knew he had defensive lapses, if he has defense at all. I had Povetkin up on the cards. So, these are vulnerable heavyweights we're talking about here. But it is a shock. It is the biggest upset since Rahman Lewis, at least, because Anthony Joshua, this Olympic gold medalist, undefeated through 20-plus heavyweight fights, had some big wins. I see a lot of revisionist history now, acting like Joshua didn't have a resume. That's a lie. He beat Joseph Parker soundly. He beat Dillian White. Rose off the canvas to knock out Vladimir Klitschko, a future Hall of Famer, even if it was when Klitschko was past his prime at age 40. And Andy Ruiz came to fight, and I'm really excited for this rematch. This rematch instantly becomes a super fight.
There will be a rematch for the fight. As we know, Anthony Joshua and his promoter, Eddie Hearn, have triggered the rematch clause in their contract. In terms of that rematch, how do you think that fight will play out, and where do you think that fight will be? I'd
be a little surprised if the rematch wasn't in the UK. I think it makes all the sense in the world. Joshua came to the US. He's a big star in the UK. Have him do it there at Wembley Stadium, sell out the place. And I'm going to go with Joshua in the rematch. He's not going to take Ruiz lightly again. I don't think Ruiz is that much better than I thought he was. I knew he was good. I still think he's good. And I think Joshua is going to get the job done next time. And if he doesn't, then Andy Ruiz is, he's a star. And it's a real changing of the guard at heavyweight.
That is for sure. Mike Coppinger, he's got his finger on the pulse of boxing. Thank you so much for the time, Mike.
Thanks a lot, man.
Interesting to note there that Mike is picking Joshua in the rematch, despite what happened on June 1st. All right, moving on. Next, we have Kelefa Sanneh. He is a staff writer for The New Yorker. He's a boxing historian, and he was a former correspondent on The Fight Game with Jim Lampley. Let's get Kelefa's take on what happened between Anthony Joshua and Andy Ruiz. Kelefa, thank you so much for joining me. Before the fight, there wasn't anyone really picking Andy Ruiz to win, and not many people picking him to be competitive. Now, he did have the 105 amateur wins. He had a virtually undefeated record. He had one very close loss to Joseph Parker. Why weren't people giving him a chance? Was it the way he looks, the optics of it with his imperfect body?
Well, it's after the fact, everyone is a genius about these things, and everyone says they saw it coming. I mean, obviously Vegas made him a pretty significant underdog. I think he was about plus 1,000, and Anthony Joshua was about minus 2,000 or something. So yeah, obviously he was certainly an underdog, but there were kind of two distinct ways people were looking at this fight going into it, right? Certainly, there were these pictures from the face-off that went kind of viral where it looked like Anthony Joshua was facing off against some security guard they pulled out of the audience. And so a lot of fans, even serious boxing fans who saw that, couldn't help but think viscerally, this short, not particularly muscle-toned guy is going to get smashed. Then on the other hand, if you were a little more serious and you looked at the records, you looked at his technique and his hand speed and his upper body movement, and that he was really close with when he fought with Joseph Parker his last time out. He knocks out was it Dimitrenko, I think. Ruiz did, and so you think, oh, he's pretty good, and Joshua is kind of flawed. That Joshua's punch mechanics maybe aren't exactly what they should be. There had been questions about his chin. I was at the Boxing Writers Awards dinner the night before the fight, and I asked some folks there, and what people kind of seemed to be saying, and what I texted my friend in the run-up to the fight, was that this guy Ruiz might give Joshua some problems. People weren't saying, oh, he's going to win, he's going to knock him out, certainly, but they were saying, oh, maybe this is kind of a tough matchup for Joshua, especially because since everyone was expecting a washout, 2-round knockout, 3-round knockout, the idea was anything besides that, and people were going to start asking questions about Joshua. So I think going in, there was this idea that this is a tough fight for Joshua. This is a fight where it might be hard for Joshua to look good, but certainly I was not expecting him to get knocked out, and I didn't talk to anyone who was expecting that.
That's exactly right. We all thought it was going to be a big knockout win for Anthony Joshua. He's been knocking out every single opponent he's faced with the exception of Joseph Parker. Other than that, he's always won by knockout. Ruiz did something smart when he went down in the third round. He took a second before he got up, kind of got his wits about him, and that obviously ended up working out in his benefit. He came back to land the shot behind Joshua's ear, knocked off his equilibrium, and knocked him down. My question is, have you you ever seen guys like that trade knockdowns so quickly on a fight of this type of magnitude on the biggest of big stages?
I'm trying to remember the sequence of knockdowns in the Deontay Wilder-Luis Ortiz fight. Because they traded knockdowns, but I can't remember if it was that close. And you know, part of what makes heavyweights interesting right now is you have this other guy, Deontay Wilder, who's known for a similar thing, right? He's got power, probably more power than Anthony Joshua, and he's got chin issues, right? I mean, they're kind of different, right? With Anthony Joshua, it seemed like he never recovered from that shot in the third round. With Deontay Wilder, he's known for getting knocked down and then recovering really well and getting up. And you know, you saw that against certainly saw that in the Luis Ortiz fight. So it's funny that for years this was something that you would never see in a heavyweight fight. And certainly for years, the biggest fights in boxing were Floyd Mayweather fights, which, you know, and Floyd Mayweather was a guy who didn't really seem to have weaknesses. At least he didn't have weaknesses that the guys he was fighting could expose. And, you know, when Floyd Mayweather fights offered us very, very few surprises. So, you know, I think that obviously, like I said, this was surprising, but part of what's interesting about the heavyweights right now is that you have these guys that are giving us interesting fights where things happen that are unexpected. And, you know, for a fan of another sport, that might sound silly to say, right? If you're a basketball fan, you're like, well, yeah, of course the game's unexpected. Of course we don't know who's going to win. But it's a strange thing about boxing that often in the super biggest fights, often they're kind of showcase fights. And, you know, there is this strange thing in boxing where, you know, like I said, for years you had Floyd Mayweather fighting in these huge pay-per-view fights where everyone kind of agreed on who was going to win. And in the case of Floyd Mayweather, he always did win.
That's exactly right. In Floyd Mayweather fights, you knew he was going to win. The surprise element was only if anyone could have success against him, like landing a big shot the way Shane Mosley did in the second round of his fight with Floyd Mayweather, or the way Manny Pacquiao did in the fourth round of his fight with Mayweather, or even Marcos Maidana.
Yeah, the Maidana landing, you know, a few shots on Floyd and kind of like fighting him tough was considered so impressive, you know, that he got a chance to do it again.
That's exactly right. I just wanted to get your perspective of the end of the fight. Joshua went down twice in that seventh round. He got up with no mouthpiece. His body language was not good. He kind of looked like he didn't want to be there. He's never had a loss before, so he doesn't know that feeling that comes with losing. He's dealing with that now in terms of heartbreak, aftermath. You could even call it humiliation. I think in a future fight, he's going to be a lot more adamant in terms of telling the ref, hey, I'm okay, I'm good to continue.
I mean, you know, first of all, I think it's important to remember that that final knockdown was the fourth knockdown. And, you know, typically in a fight, once a guy has been knocked down 4 times, not always, we've seen cases where, you know, someone could come back, but usually you're pretty well beaten by that point. And certainly it's the case that nothing about the way he responded, you know, suggested that he was like, let me at him, you know, let me go get this guy. I mean, he spits his mouthpiece out. Which is, you know, could be buying time. Who knows what that is. He wobbles back to his corner. I think if the ref wanted, the ref could have waved the fight off when he saw Anthony Joshua wobble back to the corner. You know, ref counts. You know, he says, do you want to continue? Joshua says yes, but you know, as you mentioned, he's in the corner leaning up against the ropes. I mean, now typically we expect the referee to say, walk to me and put up your gloves, as a way of demonstrating that your legs are okay. But in theory, with Joshua saying, yes, I'm ready to fight, like what would have actually happened? Like the referee would have said, okay, let's fight. And then Ruiz would have come charging into the corner with Anthony Joshua still like standing there leading up against the ropes. I'm fine. You know, boxing is such a brutal and such a dangerous sport anyway. I'm fine with what people call early stoppages. I'm fine with, you know, referees being a little quicker to say like, okay, that's enough. You know, as for the psychological part of it, obviously it's hard to know what was going through his head. I think it's important to remember that, like, you know, he'd been hit in the head a bunch. He'd been knocked down 4 times. And, you know, who knows how clearly he was even thinking at that moment. again, sometimes, you see this with boxers sometimes where the body kind of betrays them, where they're willing to fight, but their body just doesn't quite have it. So yeah, I'm not sure what the psychological part of that would mean. I think the conventional wisdom in boxing is that if a guy is perceived to have quit, then he's more likely to do it again. But like many of the things that become conventional wisdom in boxing, it's not clear that that's backed up by empirical research. It's not like we have great studies of this. Our sample size is small. Our data is very poor. So who knows exactly? And it would be interesting to see how the line would move, for the rematch, which is apparently, going to happen in the fall. But I'm not sure. So, you could make a case, as you did, that like you'd experienced this terrible thing and, of losing for the first time, and next time he's going to be that much more determined. Maybe. Or but also the way he reacted to this loss, he reacted to it like an athlete. In other words, sometimes a fighter reacts to a loss, with, denial, being like, oh, I didn't really lose, or sometimes they're just crushed by it, right? You think of Ronda Rousey in MMA when she gets knocked out by Holly Holm, she's just never the same, right? It's not like LeBron James losing a playoff game. It's like her whole world, her whole persona is cracked. He reacted to it like an athlete, right? Like Anthony Joshua's whole reaction to that loss, at least so far as we've seen publicly, has been like, hey, look, this wasn't the end of the world. It was a good fight. Things happen in boxing. I lost. I'm going to come back better. And so, you might say that, oh, that's a healthy reaction to a loss. Or you might say, here's a guy who has lost his first fight and realized it's not the end of the world. Will that make him, maybe the next time he goes into the ring, he'll know if he loses, it's not the end of the world. I don't know how much the psychological part will play a role, and I don't know how much the damage that he took in that fight will play a role. And the third thing, of course, is that this was not, as much as that shot in the third round hurt Joshua, I don't see anyone saying that this was some sort of fluke victory by Andy Ruiz, right? This was Andy Ruiz putting on a very impressive performance and showing people how you beat Anthony Joshua. And, one thing we know in boxing is that sometimes when people see that, when people see how you can be beaten as a boxer, sometimes everyone kind of catches on to it, and that makes you more vulnerable because now it's known how you can be beaten. So, I think for those reasons, I would tend, obviously no one's going to make him a 20-1 favorite, Joshua, on the rematch with Ruiz, but, I think it's possible that in a rematch, Ruiz might look even stronger.
At the time of the stoppage, it looked like Anthony Joshua's mouth was saying, I'm okay. It looked like his body language was saying, I may not be okay. You brought up the rematch, Vladimir Klitschko, when he got knocked out, when he came back, he took a more defensive approach, a more defensive style. Do you think Joshua's going to do that in the rematch? Is that his most likely course of action, kind of working behind the jab, being a little bit more technical? And how do you see that rematch playing out?
Well, I'm certainly not a boxing trainer, and I would never, I've never presumed to second guess the people who spend their lives doing this and who really know it. As again, from the perspective of a fan who watched the fight with some friends from my couch, the thing that I saw that in a weird way would give Joshua the most hope in a rematch is technical flaws. Like, he didn't use his jab very well. He didn't. Well, one of the big moments in the fight was when he threw a hook and Ruiz threw a hook at the same time, and Ruiz's hook got there first. So, and the reason I say that in a way that's a good thing for Joshua, it means that there are things he could fix if he's able to fix them, right? There's punching technique that in theory I think he could learn. Now, I don't know if he will be able to learn that. It's hard, he's a grown man, and it's hard to, change the way you fight in the course of a few months. But, obviously physically he's an incredibly imposing person, and one of the storylines from the fight was he didn't really find ways to use his height and reach against Ruiz. And, at least in theory, it's possible that he might learn how to use that height and reach, keep Ruiz at the end of his jab, and make it impossible for Ruiz to get inside and hurt him. Now, will he be able to do that in the rematch? I have no idea. But again, in a way, it's a good thing it's good news for Joshua that everyone watching that fight thought there's more he could be doing to win this fight. And so, he has things he can work on.
It's good for Anthony Joshua that there is room for improvement here. He's always been a slightly flawed fighter, and it seems like some of those flaws were actually exposed. He can now go back and work on those. It could actually turn out to be a good thing. Just to wrap it up here, wanted to ask you about where where you place this fight in history in terms of upsets. The names like Tyson, Douglas have come up, Lewis, Rahman have come up. Where does it rank for you in terms of a boxing upset?
Well, it's funny. I mean, first, I guess, when we're talking about boxing upsets, I suppose we'd want to bracket upsets where we don't necessarily think it was an upset, like the first Pacquiao-Timothy Bradley fight, where we thought the wrong guy got the decision. Because that was a big, technically that was a huge upset, but most people thought that Pacquiao won that fight.
You want to take out robberies from the conversation is what you're saying.
Yeah, I think so. There's two things with upsets, right? One of them is technically, like how much of a shock is it to the people who are in the know? And the other part is the commercial part, right? And so I think when you combine those, you've got to say this is a pretty big deal. It's certainly, I'm not sure that it outranks Tyson and Buster Douglas, but certainly it's up there with Hasim Rahman and Lennox Lewis. And because Joshua was such a big star, part of what's really fun about a fight like this is not just like, oh, the guy that we thought was going to lose, he won. But part of what I love about this, part of why it was so exciting to me to see this, was that it screwed up everyone's plans. Everyone, including me, had been talking about, oh, there's these three kings. It's Deontay Wilder, it's Tyson Fury, it's Anthony Joshua, and how are they going to fight, and when are they going to do this thing? And all those plans were kind of ruined, right? You have DAZN and has kind of building their, this upstart sports broadcasting platform, kind of building its brand largely around these two stars, Canelo and Anthony Joshua, and now one of these two stars has lost. You have British boxing, and Anthony Joshua is the biggest thing in British boxing, and now he's lost. So I think when you're calculating how big an upset this is, it's not just an athletic question, it's also a business question. And I think when you combine those two, this is huge. And also, you have the thing that you want, which is you want the underdog to be kind of a folk hero. And Ruiz has played that role really nicely. To see him on Jimmy Kimmel after the win, to see him, tweeting back and forth with Snickers about getting a Snickers sponsorship. I mean, he really does play the role of this guy who looks like a regular guy who took out this boxing star who looks like an Adonis. And that's a really fun storyline. That's something that really captures people's attention. So it's an upset, but it's an upset that's even bigger than just, boxing and sports. It kind of has some pop culture resonance. And I think that's partly what makes this seem so exciting.
That's a really interesting way to look at it. It's almost like the time period where the upset happens is what affects how big it is. Nowadays we have social media. It's on memes everywhere. He's on late night shows, like you said. We are literally seeing it everywhere. Kelefa, thank you so much for giving us your thoughts and lending us your expertise in terms of the big heavyweight upset. Hope to talk to you again soon.
Thanks so much, Curran. I'm looking forward to the next one.
That was Kelefa Sanneh of The New Yorker. As he points out, a lot remains to be seen in terms of how Joshua will bounce back from this fight, physically and, more importantly, maybe mentally. Up next, we have a very unique and interesting guest. His name is Dr. Nitin Sethi. You may not have heard that name if you're a boxing fan, but you've probably seen his face. He was the ringside physician, the ringside doctor for Anthony Joshua versus Andy Ruiz. He works all the big fights in New York, and he has a very interesting perspective on boxing and how to make the sport safer. That is his passion. Without further ado, here is my conversation with Dr. Nitin Sethi. I am speaking to Dr. Nitin K. Sethi. He is the Chief Medical Officer for the New York State Athletic Commission. He is a board-certified neurologist. He serves on the board of the Association of Ringside Physicians. You've seen him ringside at all of the biggest boxing matches in New York. He's always there. Dr. Sethi, thank you for coming on the podcast. And I just wanted to ask you a little bit about your background in medicine and how you got into boxing.
Well, thank you for having me, Mr. Bhatia. It's a pleasure and honor to talk to you and your audience. Well, I was born in Buffalo, New York, but I was raised in India. So growing up in India, I really was never exposed to boxing. The games I played was soccer and cricket. But after finishing my medical school and my residency in internal medicine in India, my father had trained as a neurologist in New York, and he advised me to go to New York because that's the place where you train to be a good neurologist. So I came here and I did my residency in neurology. And during that time, I just reached New York. I really did not know many people in the city. Had no family here, so I happened to walk into a boxing gym one day, and there was a trainer, and he saw me peeping in through the door, and he said, he asked me to come inside. He said, and by that time I realized people could not say my first name, Nitin, so well. In America, they used to all call me Sethi. So he said, what's your name? I said, I'm Sethi. He said, do you want to box? I said, yeah, sure, I'll box. And that was how I started boxing, and I got into boxing. It's amazing sport, and I'm fortunate I trained with some very good people. And during that time, I was finishing my residency in neurology. I got very interested in traumatic brain injuries, concussions. So at some point in time, I wanted to mix my love of boxing, my passion of neurology, and I was very passionate about trying to make boxing safer. So I approached the New York State Athletic Commission, and I requested them, could I be a ringside physician for them? And, I was accepted. And I've been working as a ringside physician since then. And about in 2016, it's an honor that I was appointed as the Chief Medical Officer for the New York State Athletic Commission. And so that's how it all happened.
And we've always seen you ringside at these big fights, especially in New York. You're always checking up on these fighters. I wanted to ask you, when you're at a big fight, whether it be at Madison Square Garden, Barclays, wherever, what do you consider your most important role? I know that fighter safety is important to you. So how do you make sure that these fighters stay safe?
Well, Mr. Bhatia, boxing, whether a small club event or a big event, a lot of media coverage in Barclays or Madison Square Garden, is boxing. And then as a neurologist, I'm acutely aware that there's a very high potential for acute traumatic brain injury. And obviously over the years, these fighters also have a risk for chronic neurological injuries. So I'm very happy to say that the New York State Athletic Commission has really our medical team has really emphasized that, and we really put that health and safety of the boxers front and foremost when we are working a fight, no matter, like I said, whether it's a small club event or an event in a big venue like Madison Square Garden.
I know you can't get too much into the details of last Saturday night in terms of, due to HIPAA regulations, but when there is a big heavyweight fight, we had the Anthony Joshua versus Andy Ruiz fight. I'm just wondering, do you come in with a different preparation, knowing that heavyweights can hit harder, the knockouts could be harder, there could be more possibility for brain injury or the fight being stopped? Do you have a different preparation when it's a heavyweight fight specifically?
Well, you asked a good question, and I obviously cannot speak about the fight itself. That information, like you said, is HIPAA protected. But in any boxing fight, heavyweight, other weight classes, the potential for acute traumatic brain injuries are always there. And I think as a physician, you'll be naive to think that it doesn't exist. I always feel that you cannot you cannot ever make boxing completely safe. You can only make it more safer. That's what I feel, and that's the way I approach boxing. That it's a hard sport to make completely safe. So we have really emphasized a lot of things which go on in the background, which your audience may or may not see. And with your permission, I'd like to kind of elaborate about that. So a lot of these things which happen, which even the public is not aware of, starts a few weeks before the fight actually comes on. As a commission, we request medical records of the fighters. These medical records are very, very closely reviewed by us, by our medical team. And I can only talk about our commission. We have very particular medical requirements with respect to they have to present an MRI of the brain leading up to the fight. We'll request other medical records like an EKG. Obviously we check for infectious diseases like hepatitis, HIV. They have to be negative for that. And then based on these fighters, as we're looking at the medical records, we as a medical team of the commission may request additional medical testing for clearance. So this is for clearance for them to fight. And that might require a neurology clearance or making them see a cardiologist and get a cardiology clearance. So that happens a few weeks leading up to the fight. Now, once if a fighter clears that medical requirements, then I think I would jump to the day of the weigh-in. They probably, again, the public doesn't really see us. We are working behind the scenes, but at the weigh-in, at the time of the weigh-in, each fighter undergoes a weigh-in physical. And this physical is pretty exhaustive. They undergo a complete medical evaluation by a certified ringside physician. And ringside physicians are coming from different backgrounds of training. And then all the medical records again reviewed. And then they need to clear that that weigh-in physical. So once they clear the weigh-in physical, that's a day before the fight goes on, they also have a pre-fight physical. So a pre-fight physical is right before the fight itself. So that's now the day of the fight. Each fighter undergoes a pre-fight physical. During the pre-fight physical, most of the times you're looking at things like hydration status. Have they hydrated themselves well after taking weight? Is there any new concern which has arisen since the time they had the weigh-in physical to the day of the fight itself? So if you're looking at it now, look at how many things have been done. The medicals have been checked. Now they had one physical at the time of the weigh-in. They have a pre-fight physical. Now let's assume the fighter clears all of these things. Then all the attention shifts to the day of the fight and ringside. And that's how kind of everything which happens in the background, all with the idea to ensure the health and safety of the fighters.
Right, so there's a lot of testing and precautions that go into a fighter being allowed to fight in New York. There's a lot of people sharing information and working together. Just getting back to the fight last Saturday a little bit, like I said, I know you're not allowed to talk specifics about the fighter, but just to go over what happened, Andy Ruiz got up from the canvas on the third round. He landed a big shot behind Anthony Joshua's ear, which kind of took him off his equilibrium. Joshua was off balance, falling over a little bit. And then in the seventh round, Joshua got knocked down again, and he kind of got up and gave a little smirk to Andy Ruiz. It was a little bit of an odd, an odd thing to do. And then we all know at later in that round, the referee asked Joshua if he was okay. Joshua said he was, but the referee didn't like his body language and stopped the fight. Afterwards, Joshua says he doesn't remember anything from that third round. He says his senses weren't there. So I know you can't speak specifically to Anthony Joshua, but my question is, when a fighter exhibits those type of things, they don't have their balance, their equilibrium is gone, they're maybe acting a little bit different than they normally would with some kind of odd behavior. Are those types of things that you would see and say, okay, this fighter probably has suffered a concussion during this fight?
Well, Mr. Bhatia, again, very good questions. And again, with the limitations, I can't speak about the fight itself. That would be irresponsible of me. What I feel is the emphasis should be that I strongly believe the one way to make boxing safe, or I should say more safe or safer, is education, education, education. Because sometimes when I talk about this, I say, if for heaven forbid something really bad occurs in the ring during the fight or immediately after fight, the cause is going to be neurological. And you may have a fighter who suffers a hand injury, shoulder dislocation. That's not going to cause some sort of a fatal outcome. It's the neurological injuries where you really worry about, because they can present very in an insidious fashion. For example, a lot of people don't know that you don't need to have loss of consciousness for a concussion to occur. A boxer walks into a stiff jab. A boxer walks into a right. Football field, you see a helmet-to-helmet contact. For a few seconds, if you're looking at that athlete, you see them, they're stunned. Later you ask them, they might say, hey, doc, I felt my bell being wrong. But there's no loss of consciousness. Many times the ref will say, are you okay? And the boxer will say, yeah, I'm fine. And the fight goes on. So that's one of the big problems. I wouldn't say that it's not a problem, but that's one of the big things we need to realize about boxing. In boxing, every punch thrown at the head is thrown with the idea of causing a concussion. You want to knock the other person out. So in boxing, mild concussions or mild grade of concussions are happening all the time. Boxers are getting hit. You'll see them stagger for a second or two, sometimes a little bit of a glazed look in the eye, a little small period of confusion or disorientation, and then they come out of it. And that's the thing why boxing is so hard to make completely safe. Because if the ref in New York, one thing you should know is either the ref or the ringside physician can step up and stop a fight. In a lot of commissions, only the ref can stop a fight. So if a ref starts stopping the fight for every mild concussion, they'll be very hard to have any boxing. So, that's the way the way I look at it is you're keeping a very close watch on the fighters, looking at exactly how they're behaving during the course of the fight, and at some point in time, you have to, if you need to, you have to do a medical stoppage. And I have talked about this a lot. There's something called a good medical stoppage versus a bad medical stoppage. A good medical stoppage, in my humble opinion, is a stoppage done at the right time. You don't want to stop a fight too early. You certainly don't want to stop it too late. It's a stoppage done for the right indication. Now let's assume me as a ringside physician or the referee stops a fight for a laceration, and really the laceration was not causing any major problem to the fighter. He or she was able to see. A lot of the people will say that's a bad medical stoppage. You did not need to stop the fight at that point in time. So, you want a good medical stoppage versus a bad medical stoppage, which is a stoppage which you do either too late or you do it for the wrong reasons. So I think that's kind of the principle which we in New York really try to adhere to, is have the stoppage happen for the right medical reason at the right time. Neither too early, certainly not too late.
There is a framework that we have in boxing. We have certain regulations on gloves, on weight. Even with that said, fighters still do get concussions. There's a chance for CTE. My question is, you're doing everything you can to keep these fighters safe in a barbaric sport the way the rules are now. Would you like to see any rules change? Do you want different glove sizes? Do you want headgear? Do you want rehydration clauses? Is there any rules that you'd like to see altered for the safety of the sport?
Again, Mr. Bhatia, as a person who you seem to be very knowledgeable about the sport, you raised some very valid points, and a lot of these things have been looked at. How can boxing be made more safer? Like I said, in my opinion, it cannot be made completely safe. It's a combat sport, but certainly, the onus is on us as physicians to try to make this sport more safer, and things like which you have raised about glove size, about obviously wearing protective headgear, dehydration concerns leading up to a fight, use of performance enhancing drugs, which is now becoming again an issue which has raised a lot of concerns. These are all things which need to be looked at, and they have to be looked at collectively. The commissions, the sports governing bodies. But I think at an individual level, what I strongly feel is education. We really need to educate the boxer, the corners, the public about concussions, because a lot of times people don't know when they're concussed. Like I said, the signs might be so subtle that you may never pick it up. The other thing about concussion, if I may take one more minute, is that the signs are all subjective. So when you have somebody, like, for example, you bang your head against a door right now, and you might be concussed, but I'll ask you, do you have headache? And if you say I don't have headache, there's no way for me to know that you have headache. So a lot of times this culture in boxing where you go up to the corner and you ask the fighter, are you hurt? Do you have headache? Sometimes some corners, some boxers, no, I don't have headache. They deny it flatly. And these are all subjective things. If somebody's denying it, it's very hard for you objectively to figure out what's going on as a doctor, even as a neurologist. Obviously, when you have a thing which is clearly visible, a fighter is clearly unstable on his or her feet, that is a much more easier way to say, I think he's hurt. So I think the culture has to change a little bit, and I've written about that the boxing culture has to be changed. Just like in football, early on it was a culture of you got a hit, you shake it off, and you continue to play. Now it is that if you got a hit, you bring it to the attention of the doctors on the sideline and let them evaluate you. Same way in boxing, with the limitations of the sport, that you cannot have something done which will completely change how the sport is. Like, for example, if you start having professional boxers wearing headgear, then you change the nature of the sport, which again is something above my pay grade. That's something which other sports governing bodies have to look at. But I think education is something which we can do right now, which tells people to better identify concussions and how do you manage them.
Absolutely. And I've read an interview from you where you said, if you're a ringside physician, you're probably not doing it necessarily for the money. So you're obviously very passionate about what you do. I know you've written a book, Neurologist at Ringside, and it seems like you do this for the love of the sport, to help athletes, to help fighters be more safe. So is that accurate to say that this is your passion in terms of helping athletes be more safe?
Certainly, I think it's a passion. It's an honor to this. It's such a more I've seen boxing up close. It's a beautiful sport. The people who are in boxing, the boxers, coaches, promoters. It's a beautiful sport. You meet so many people. There's so many good things about boxing, and so it's that passion which comes ringside, where you do it. We do it from our side, at least from the doctor's point of view. We do it to protect the health and safety of the boxers. That's our most important thing. When I go to bed in the night after a boxing event, I want to go with the feeling that with the limitations which I discussed, I did my best to protect these fighters. And if I have done that, I think I've served my duty, and I think that's the way I approach it. It's a sport which can at times be very humbled, and so I always approach it in that way with a lot of respect, but at the same time with a lot of passion to try to make it even more safer.
Dr. Sethi, thank you so much for your expertise and your push for higher education for boxer safety. Thank you for your insight, and I look forward to seeing you again ringside at the next big fight.
It was my pleasure, and thank you for giving me this opportunity to speak to you and your listeners, Mr. Bhatia.
Great stuff there from Dr. Sethi and his push to make the sport safer using education. Let's keep it moving. Next, we have Evan Rutkowski. We used to actually work together back at HBO. He is going to break it down from a business perspective. What does this upset mean for subscribers? Who are the main players in today's boxing landscape? There's new services out there. There's streaming. There's old school pay-per-view. We're going to hear that all from Evan Rutkowski. He's the host of the Fistianados podcast. Evan, we obviously just witnessed one of the biggest upsets of all time. My first question for you is Andy Ruiz. When you first heard about this matchup with him and Anthony Joshua, did you think that Andy Ruiz had a chance?
I thought he had a chance to make it fun. I didn't think he had a chance to win, but I guess everybody has that chance to win, which we obviously now know. This one didn't seem preordained in the way that like Golovkin rolls this weekend seems a little bit preordained. Some of those types of things. Like it did feel like there was a pathway. I think I actually said this on my podcast. I think there was a pathway for Andy to make it really fun, but I didn't think he would win. But hey, I mean, look, it's fun to be wrong sometimes, right?
It really is. And before we get into the fight, I just wanted to ask your thoughts. I heard you talk about this on your podcast. The different relationship that the zone actually has with someone like Canelo Alvarez versus Anthony Joshua. If this was Canelo Alvarez losing, it would have been a much bigger blow to the zone, right?
It would have been a disaster. I mean, because it's I think, especially in a fight like this, like it would have been the equivalent of Canelo losing to Rocky Fielding, and then you got 10 more fights and a ton more money coming. If you assume that the entire contract is guaranteed. But Anthony Joshua, I mean, I don't think DAZN was paying Anthony Joshua huge license fees to televise, in America, to televise his fights when he fought in the UK. I mean, I know they paid a lot of money to bring him to America, but from that standpoint, in terms of brand recognition, I mean, this is a complete home run. Basically, the first time they bring him to America, no one's really heard of DAZN and no one's really heard of Anthony Joshua. And if he wins, in rounds, if round 3 ends differently and it's Joshua by KO, it's tough to get publicity for this. Now everybody knows who Anthony Joshua is. Everybody knows who Andy Ruiz is. Everybody knows what DAZN is. I mean, it's kind of great from that perspective.
And we'll get into the potential for the rematch and how big that will be for the zone. But obviously I have to ask you about the third round moment, Ruiz going down. We all think the fight's over, and somehow he gets back up and takes absolute control of this fight, knocks down Joshua 4 times. When you saw this, I mean, just give us what was your reaction?
Well, when Ruiz went down and I'm sitting there watching it with my wife, and she doesn't watch too many fights with me, but she was legitimately worried for him at that point. You could kind of see in his face though, and I've watched the round again a number of times, but you could kind of see it that he had his senses. Like he got caught, but he understood. You could see him go through sort of mentally the checklist, like, okay, I'm up, I'm ready, and like now I got to do what I got to do. And that actually, he reacted the right way, because he brought, when Anthony Joshua went in for the finish, that's when it got dangerous. And it's funny because when I watched it live, I didn't see the I didn't notice Joshua's body buckle. I saw Ruiz connected, and I saw that he was on shaky legs, but I didn't notice how much of a buckle it really was. And when you watch the replay, I mean, it's clear that he was out right at that moment. Like that was it for Anthony Joshua. And he fought through. He probably got concussed right there, and he probably fought through it. And had the round, had Ruiz had more time at the end of the round, I mean, it could have been over in round 3 for Ruiz.
There was definitely something going on for Joshua, whether it was a concussion. After the first knockdown in the 7th round, he kind of got up and smiled at Ruiz. It was just an odd thing to do. His body language obviously did not look good. And he's going to have to deal with the backlash now of taking that first loss. So when that loss happened, you heard people say, oh my God, this is terrible for the zone. I'm in agreement with you, where I think it's a great thing. I think the rematch is going to be huge now. I think that this fight, just by the optics of it, the way that Ruiz looks, has now, and the fact that he's heavyweight champion, has now come into the mainstream, and I think people are going to be interested in a rematch. My question for you is do you agree, and how big do you think the rematch will be? Is this going to increase subscribers substantially?
Absolutely. No, this is a sub driver. I think that basically with the difference between Canelo and AJ, going back to sort of that initial concept that we were talking about. So every time Canelo's in a big fight, especially when he's in a really big fight, that's a sub driver for DAZN. That drives subscriptions in a real way. And that's what DAZN needs right now. They're not in the business yet of keeping their subscriber base truly happy. Like they're in the business of gaining subscribers. And what kind of fights gain subscribers? It's really, you can put on those fight cards, like the April 26th card, you can put on the World Boxing Super Series and sort of, the April 20, I think it was the 26th card at the Forum, all you want. Those are fights that keep the hardcore base happy. Those aren't the sub drivers. This is now a sub driver. And AJ probably in the United States was oddly in the category of keeping hardcore fans happy rather than driving subs. The fight that would have been a sub driver is if they would have gotten Wilder for 2 fights. And now, just sort of through sheer luck, they made the news because of this upset, and the rematch is going to be a huge sub driver.
Fury Wilder 2 has been announced for early next year, which is odd because they both have fights lined up. Tyson Fury, obviously, with ESPN. Wilder has been fighting on Showtime. So the question is, for that rematch, how do you see that working out with the different networks?
I don't think it's as hard in the Fox ESPN world, and maybe it's Showtime. I don't know who's gonna get that, but certainly in the Fox ESPN world, it feels like those things are going to be easier to make because I think there's just less things to argue about. There's not, within the Showtime and HBO world, one of the big sticking points is who gets the replay or how do you do the replay. Like, this is a huge deal. And I mean, you can speak to this for Klitschko, Joshua. That wasn't on pay-per-view, but that was just figuring that part out of it was it took so long that we weren't even really allowed to market the fight. And in Pacquiao, Mayweather Pacquiao, like at HBO the following week, we had Canelo fighting, and it was this sort of big race. Like, we had both networks could start it at exactly the same time. And I just don't know that Fox and ESPN care about that stuff as much. Maybe they do, but I don't really think they do. And I think that's one less thing to argue about. And I also just think it's just, they're not really in the business of, yes, they want to be the best in terms of boxing, but like they also have so many other sports that they're doing. So this isn't, whereas with HBO and Showtime, like the prestige of upping the other on any single point, it mattered so much. In this, I just don't know if it's that. I think it should be easier to make.
Absolutely. So that fight is already signed. We'll find out exactly where it'll land. Obviously, Ruiz and Joshua, number 2, will be on the zone. And then from there, we'll kind of have to figure it out. Depends who wins Ruiz, Joshua. Depends who wins Wilder Fury. And then it'll kind of get figured out where those future matchups will be. I wanted to put you on the spot a little bit here. Like you said, we worked side by side at HBO for a long time. And something Richard Plepler used to always say at HBO was that he likes our hand, the hand that we have at HBO. So now with all the different networks in boxing, you have PBC with Fox and Showtime. You have The Zone. You have ESPN. Whose hand do you like most in terms of being the power player in boxing? If you had to be one of the networks, who would you be?
If I had to be one of the networks right now, it's probably ESPN or Fox. I think that it's probably ESPN. It's probably ESPN. But I think if Fox truly makes a commitment to their strategy, I think to changing their strategy and really going with live events a lot more, I think they can absolutely, make an argument that they're in the best position. But, ESPN, look, it's just the simple fact it's an all sports network. Like that's the best place to find casual boxing fans and convert them to hardcore fans. That's the best place to find general sports fans and convert them to casual boxing fans, and do that whole thing. It's a very just sustainable system. You also are very balanced in the way that you've got both ESPN Plus and ESPN. So you're in the streaming business and you're also in, the regular network business. But Fox, if they really execute their strategy well, I think they're in a great spot too.
And what do you think about the landscape right now as a boxing consumer? For a long time, it was HBO and Showtime having the big fights. There would be fights on ESPN, lower level fights, Friday night fights. And then big fights would be on pay-per-view, $75, and even more sometimes for bigger fights on HD. right now it's obviously a completely different landscape. Like we said, there's fights on different networks, and there are still pay-per-views, but there's more subscription services. What do you think of life right now for a boxing fan and a boxing consumer? Is it better or worse than it used to be?
I think it's better. I think it's better, and I think it will continue to be better. First of all, I just think with the amount of money coming into the sport, usually that's a really good thing. I know traditionally boxing people say that's not a great thing, or boxing will screw it up or something like that. And I just think we're in a different era where it's not just a couple sort of lazy promoters taking TV money and you have to prove yourself and continually prove yourself on ESPN and Fox and these other, you can't just put up a low rating and it doesn't matter. They're selling ads against the fights. You need to perform. So I think for consumers in this new era, it's like you're seeing a lot of different options. There's a lot more money. Yes, where you're missing out, I think what will end up happening is for the big pay-per-view fights, promoters and networks will work together more often. I think you'll see that more often. I think for the fights on the network, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense unless you're doing the trade. I know that it was just on Boxing Scene yesterday or today where DAZN and Matchroom and ESPN and Top Rank are sort of executing a trade, and you're going to see some good fights from it. And I think those are possible, and hopefully they become much more the norm. So you see a better product on regular television, not pay-per-view. But just your week in, week out fights, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to regularly sort of put fighters on other platforms for that. I mean, it makes sense to put your best products forward, but it's an incredibly competitive marketplace. And I think that, I think consumers will end up winning. Now, what we also have seen here, and I know I'm rambling on this, but this is something I've talked a lot about. There's also just a ton of product coming into the marketplace. And I think what's annoying is when HBO and Showtime were at their best, they were curating the product really well for consumers. And that's not necessarily happening. Like usually we're getting 2 or 3 really great fights or, per weekend, it's just on 2 or 3 fight cards. So it's kind of annoying to have to watch all of it and you see some crap, with the good stuff.
There's a lot more competition now. It's better for the fans, but there's dilution there in cards as well. So before we wrap up, it was such an amazing upset. And just to put a bow on it, I've heard you compare it to Tyson Douglas. I just want to know where this heavyweight upset ranks in your all-time list.
I think it's behind Tyson Douglas, and I think it's ahead. I know the other candidates are Rahman and maybe Klitschko versus Corey Sanders, and I just think it's ahead. It's ahead of those. I think this has entered the public consciousness much more so than anything since Tyson Douglas. And some of that is the nature of the upset and the odds, but some of that is just who Andy Ruiz is and who Anthony Joshua is. I mean, it's just impossible to look at both fighters and think to yourself that Andy Ruiz has a chance at winning, even if you're a hardcore boxing fan and you understand the skill level that he fights at. It's just human nature to look at the comparison and think anything else. I mean, Buster Douglas was in shape and yes, like everybody thought Tyson was invincible, but Buster Douglas, like he did not come in looking anything remotely like Andy Ruiz did. So I think that's part of that will be part of the historical lore of this fight as well. Whether and to Ruiz's credit, he sort of takes that in stride. Like he understands that's part of it and he has fun with it. And I think that will serve him very well in the future.
I completely agree. I think people sitting on the couch watching say, hey, that guy looks like me and he's heavyweight champion of the world. And I think it is great that Ruiz does embrace it. Hopefully he gets that Snickers deal or endorsement soon. We'll be watching for that. Evan, thank you so much for the time and breaking down the big heavyweight upset.
Thanks for having me.
That was Evan Rutkowski breaking down what happened from a business perspective. Next up, we're going to talk to Dave Harmon. He is the producer for The Zone. He was producing this fight in the TV truck. He's going to give us his perspective on what it was like to be there. He has produced some of the biggest fights in the last 30 years. Where does Joshua Ruiz rank in all the great fights that he's produced?
I am speaking with Dave Harmon. He was a producer at HBO for many years, producing the biggest fights in the world and now producing for The Zone. Dave, you were the producer for one of the biggest heavyweight fights of all time, one of the biggest heavyweight upsets of all time, Anthony Joshua versus Andy Ruiz. What was it like for you in terms of preparation, getting ready for a big Anthony Joshua fight and knowing that you're producing this for people around the world to see?
Well, there's a lot that goes into it. So let's focus on what's different about a fight like this.
Sure.
Because it has worldwide attention, Sky TV and all around the world, there are all broadcasters that wind up coming to Madison Square Garden as well. So I'm not just in the end in charge of the Zone's broadcast, because all these other broadcasters take the Zone feed and want to know all sorts of details about what we're going to do, what we have planned, when they have to get off us because we're doing things unique to the Zone. And so I would say it's a very technical job in that point, in that we have to be prepared to have everyone in the world following along as we get ready for this show. Once we get to the actual fight, covering a fight is the same whether it's a big fight or the smallest fight. Is you don't want to miss a punch. You want to always have the best angles, so you're not blocked by the ref or the fighters, and you have as many replay angles as possible so that you're not blocked by the fighters or the ref again for that.
And we'll get to the fight in a second, but one thing I'd love to hear you talk about, I've heard you talk about this in the past, is peaking for that main event. Because if you're in a production truck, anyone who's worked in a production truck, you know that it's going to be a very long day. There's going to be many undercards, and you really want to be at your best when that main event hits. When Anthony Joshua is walking to the ring, you want to be at your peak state. So how do you try to do that? And how do you try to tell the crew and the people working with you to try to have that same mentality?
I do tell that to every crew, and I do remind myself during the 5 to 6 other fights that we wound up with 6 fights before the main event this past Saturday, before the Joshua Ruiz fight. And you can think about it all you want, but when Katie Taylor has a big fight and Callum Smith has a big fight, I'm not really sure how I do pace myself. I can't say I talk less, because the people who need to hear me are everywhere. They're in the dressing rooms with the fighters. They're in the ring with Michael Buffer or David Diamante. They're in the truck with the Zone people. There's people in the doing replays. There are people doing graphics. All these people for each fight need to know what's up. So while I wish I could actually pace myself, I don't really have a formula of how to do it, other than reminding myself not to get too excited and too invested in any of the previous fights, so that by the time I get to the main event, I'm exhausted. And, with this past weekend, we went on the air at 4:30 p.m. and really weren't done until midnight. So however it got from A to B it takes a lot of practice. It takes a lot of stamina by doing other shows and not having that as your first or second show. Once you've done a lot of shows, perhaps maybe that makes it a little easier too.
It certainly was a very long night, a shocking night, obviously. And your fight week preparation, you're preparing the format or the rundown, you're going to meetings with the fighters, interviewing them, talking to them, you're speaking with people who are going to be working with you in the truck. Was there ever a sense from anyone that you talked to that it was possible that Ruiz would even pull off the upset? We knew he was a late opponent for Jarrell Miller, who dropped out, but everyone seemed to be focusing on Anthony Joshua. He's the heavyweight champion. He's undefeated. Everyone wants to see him fight Wilder. It seemed like Ruiz, maybe the way he looks, maybe, if you look at, he has a loss on his record, even though it was a close fight. No one necessarily gave him a chance. When you were preparing for this during fight week, did you hear anyone giving him a chance, or were you thinking like everyone else, hey, this is going to be Joshua doing his thing?
Well, I was thinking it was going to be Joshua doing his thing, but not in 1 or 2 rounds, but against an experienced fighter having it take 5, 6 rounds. I will want to give credit. There were 2 people that I did hear give him more of a chance than that. The first was Sergio Mora. He is the color analyst for DAZN, and he walked around saying he's the Mexican Rocky. Andy Ruiz, but and everyone thought at first he was just making some cute little thing, but he was serious. He felt like a lot of the parallels between the way Apollo Creed picked Rocky out of the phone book and the way he thought that no one was giving Rocky and Ruiz a chance had a lot of parallels. And if you listen to his call, even of round 1 of the Ruiz fight, he is all over what the difference was in how Andy Ruiz was coming forward and being the aggressor and giving himself the best chance to win, and Anthony Joshua was not. The other is Lee Groves of CompuBox. CompuBox gives reports on how they see fights going from a statistical basis, and they noted that ever since the Anthony Joshua fight against Vlad Klitschko, that Joshua had significantly reduced his punch output against his opponents since then. And one of the things that Lee Groves felt was that was because, he doesn't know for sure, but he said it seemed like a discussion of another guy, the way when Vlad Klitschko got upset, that Anthony Joshua, by realizing he almost lost, was now going to fight a more safety-first fight, protect his chin a little bit more. And so against Takam, Parker, and Povetkin, Lee Groves noticed that Anthony's offense was significantly reduced without his connect percentage going up. Because obviously there's a different way to look at older fighters, that they get wiser, like Juan Manuel Marquez, and they throw less punches, but they land more. But Anthony Joshua isn't an older fighter, and he wasn't landing more. So Lee Groves said, don't know what this means, having a new safety-first Anthony Joshua, but if his chin is suspect, if his defense isn't up to speed, then this might not be the best way for Anthony Joshua to approach the next part of his career. So I think those things, look, they were in my head, what Sergio Mora and Lee Groves were saying as the fight started, but it wasn't until the end of round 1 that I started going, yeah, these guys may have a little point here.
So credit to Sergio Mora, credit to Lee Groves, seeing something, maybe the kernel of an idea of something that other people were not seeing. As the main event started, could you give people who may not have worked with you before in a production truck, just give a little perspective of where you are? You're obviously in the production truck. You're talking to people on headset, 40, 50 people, to directors, to announcers, to stage managers. Give us your perspective of where you were. And I'd also like to know, I think the most interesting moment in the fight is Ruiz goes down. That was somewhat expected. He gets up and somehow lands a shot on the side of Joshua's head and knocks him down, which I think was one of the most shocking moments in recent memory. Give us perspective of where you were when that happened and what was going through your head.
Okay, so the TV truck looks an awful lot like you expect it to from movies and television shows, which show you a mobile unit with 1 million monitors in it. And that's what the DAZN truck does look like. They park it in a little protected area in the Madison Square Garden region of between 31st and 33rd Streets between 7th and 8th Avenues. They don't have to park them on the street that way. They just park them tucked into the garden. So this mobile unit, which is as large as a full tractor trailer, is filled with monitors and hard drive, EVS, machines which have replaced tape machines, and they're more like what you'd have on a DVR. And so in the control room I'm sitting next to the director of the show, Rick Basinski, and the technical director, Vlad, who's pushing all the buttons that the director is calling out cameras, the director's calling out tape machines, the director's calling out effects for replay wipes. All the technical stuff comes from the technical director. So they're on one row. The row behind me is Matt Miller, who's the head of boxing for DAZN, and Sophia Zinger, who's the head of graphics for DAZN. And the graphics are the things you see on the screen that show you the round number, the clock, what their trunk colors are, any statistics from CompuBox, any other information we might want to give you about Joshua Ruiz. All those things that are text come from there. And Sophia is in charge of 2 separate graphic operators who actually are the ones who are the technicians on that. Those are the key people in the first 2 rows there. There's a 3rd row with very important people like John McCormick, but for my purposes, I am concerned during the fight with those first 2 rows. And on the headset, I am in constant communication with everyone you're saying, people at ringside, people in the tape room, for what's going on. So the 3rd round starts, and yes, Ruiz gets knocked down, and we quickly wind up finding that, we have some great replay angles for that. We have multiple angles for that, and we're ready to show that. Ruiz gets up, and I don't know if you noticed, just before Ruiz knocks Joshua down, Joshua tried to end the fight with like a Wilder-like right hand, and he kind of grazes Ruiz with it. But because he's committed so unbelievably fully for a professional fighter like Ruiz, it turned into Ruiz's opportunity. And yes, within probably about 15 seconds of getting up from being knocked down, Ruiz has now knocked Joshua down. So I have to deal with the people in the replay area. Okay, we have angles of Ruiz getting knocked down. Now we need angles of Anthony Joshua getting knocked down. Once they show me all the different angles we only have a minute between rounds to show these replays. So the next problem is, I'm thinking during this fight in particular, with how poorly Anthony Joshua is looking at the end of the round. We have to be careful not to show too many replays, because if we show too many replays, we won't have time to see Anthony Joshua's corner, to see how clear-eyed he is, to see what his trainer McCracken is saying, to see what he might be saying to McCracken. And so some of the most important parts of a live show are the live things, not just the replays. So I found a way to choose the best angles, to have the corner at the same time. And I think the only thing that went poorly in between rounds there is that we didn't get all the replays fully in. And so as the bell starts for round 4, we're still finishing a replay. And that's only a risk, in that if in the first 3 seconds of the next round, Ruiz had knocked Joshua down again, we might not have seen it. So you don't want to have replays spilling over into the next round. But because it was one of the most interesting rounds in boxing, in heavyweight boxing, recent memory, I took the risk, and we were rewarded because we got all the replays in, and you still saw all the action in the next round.
Being in that arena, it was absolutely electric, as you would have imagined. But as Ruiz got up and knocked down Joshua, I think everyone's jaw went to the floor. And it was a moment of shock but once everyone picked up their jaw off the floor, they started to root for Ruiz. It was a heavy UK crowd, and it seemed like everyone started to root for Ruiz because in a way it seems like just based on how he looks, he represents the everyman, and people started to root for him. And it was as he knocked out Joshua finally, or the ref waved it off in the last round, people were happy and excited. And my question for you is, as someone who's in the arena or a fan, you're just taking this moment in and thinking of what this means, and you're happy for Ruiz. For you as the producer, you don't have a moment to have that moment of perspective. You have to tell this story, and you have to let people watching around the world get the analysis from the announcers, get interviews. So just take me a little bit through your thought process when the fight's being waved off, and what are you thinking at that moment, and what's next for you there?
Well, when a fight is waved off, I got to say, I've watched enough boxing in my life that it wasn't really a surprise at that point that it was waved off. So there was no real shock in the truck. So at that point, I'm thinking of how can we best show replays of what led to the stoppage. And I did notice that the ref spent a particularly long amount of time with Joshua in the corner asking, "Are you okay?" And we have mics on all these things. So besides replays of the final knockdowns and the stoppage, I asked the tape room in this particular case for something unique, which was to dedicate one person to put on a pair of headphones and listen very carefully to the exchange in the corner between the ref and Joshua to see if there's something worth playing back for our audience that we might not have caught the first time. And in fact, there was something. So I alert the announcers that besides the replays, I also have this bit of corner audio of the stoppage. And Brian Kenny, our blow-by-blow guy, after he sees it on the air, then on the air says, "Wow, I'm glad I saw that, because I heard something I didn't hear before. I knew the ref had asked if he was okay, but I heard Anthony Joshua say yes. And then I heard it in a way that he didn't have much conviction. So it really did enlighten for me." And this is Brian Kenny still talking. It really enlightened for me, good decision to stop the fight. Really good decision, because that exchange was fascinating. So I'm particularly proud of that moment, that we found that little nugget in the audio and didn't just have slow-mo replays, which don't have audio.
For you, you've been involved in the production of the biggest fights in recent memory. You've been producing fights for over 30 years. A lot of the biggest boxing moments. Just to wrap it up, I'd like to know where you rank this fight, heavyweight championship, belts changing hands, a massive upset. I just want to know where you rank this in boxing history in terms of fights that you've been at live, in terms of upsets. Where do you place Joshua versus Ruiz?
I'm going to have to stick with fights I've been at. And the reason I'm going to say that is not because I'm a person who doesn't know my boxing history, but it's very hard for me to put like Cinderella Man, James Braddock in like context of these kinds of things, or Max Schmeling beating Joe Louis. Everyone's so quick to say, that the thing that just happened is the biggest or the greatest. I don't know. I don't know about fights like that. So here's my ranking. Number one biggest shock that I was at and working was Tyson over Douglas. Number two was Hasim Rahman over Lennox Lewis in South Africa. And three is Andy Ruiz over Anthony Joshua. So, I don't know in what order we want to go in here with my list, but what intrigues you about my list?
I mean, that right there is rarefied air, right? I mean, that's putting it up there with the biggest upsets of all time.
Okay, yeah. If I want to defend one, because lots of people have been talking about Tyson Douglas, the thing about Hasim Rahman and Lennox Lewis at that time was that everyone did consider Lennox Lewis to be a really full champion. He had the height, he had the reach, he had the power, he had the defense. He had his own shocking moments in his career before, but he was at his height of his powers as a heavyweight champion and getting the respect at that time. And he had even, which we wonder, we'll never know, whether contributed to that upset. He was playing a part in Ocean's 11 and was late in getting to South Africa for the rest of his training because he was too busy filming a movie. And so when Hasim Rahman came out, because of the time change in Africa, it was about 10 a.m. when that fight started in Africa, in a tent in the middle of nowhere, where South Africa had just come out of apartheid, and Larry Merchant had just done an interview with the recently freed Nelson Mandela on that telecast. It felt like this big coming out party for Lennox Lewis. And so for having this American come over to South Africa during all that and take a champion like that out, my jaw was more on the floor just by a little bit than even Anthony Joshua losing to Andy Ruiz.
I don't know for sure, but I think Hasim Rahman may have snuck in some Snickers before that fight.
Well, then that's a nice common denominator then.
Dave Harmon produced some of the biggest fights in boxing history. The producer for Anthony Joshua versus Andy Ruiz, and I'm sure you'll be producing the rematch when they lock horns again. Thanks so much for your time and breaking it down for us.
Thanks, Curran.
That was Dave Harmon breaking it down for us with his unique perspective. Next up is Dan Canobbio. You've seen him on Twitter. You've seen him as an announcer on Fox. He is also part of CompuBox. They track the punch statistics of fights. They look at the trends. We're going to get his take of Anthony Joshua versus Andy Ruiz from a numbers perspective.
Speaking with Dan Canobbio, Fox Sports commentator, CompuBox operator. You're a numbers guy, crunching the numbers ringside. Tell us a little bit about Joshua and Ruiz. Obviously, you were shocked at the result, as we all were. From a numbers perspective, what do you think about it?
I mean, from a strictly numbers standpoint, I was kind of taken back by the low amount of punches that Anthony Joshua was throwing in the fight. He kind of changed his whole style up after he beat Klitschko. Before he fought Klitschko, 11 fights tracked by CompuBox, he was throwing like 50 punches around, which is a little bit more than average for a heavyweight. After he fought Klitschko, and he had the belts, he kind of changed his whole style up. He went from being like a seek and destroy power puncher. I think it was something like 60% of his punches were power punches. Kind of flipped it around to 60% of his punches were jabs now in the 4 fights since Klitschko. So he was on record all week long. That was Joshua saying that, I kind of want to go out there and be like Wilder. I want to be reckless. I want to be a KO artist, but my team kind of won't let me. My guys won't let me. And maybe I'm thinking, why would he admit something like that? Maybe his team knew that, he's a little chinny. Maybe his team knew that, when he trades, he kind of leaves his head up. And look what he did in that third round with Ruiz. He tagged him. He had him on the ground. And I thought he got a little reckless. I thought he got a little carried away. He probably wanted to knock him out in spectacular fashion in that third round, especially if he was dealing with what we've heard he's dealing with, anxiety issues, maybe a concussion, maybe got dropped, all that stuff. But, it just showed me that Joshua, this isn't the fighter that he wants to be. I feel like he wants to throw more punches, but I was taken back by the low amount of punches. He's only throwing 25 punches around in the 7 rounds with Ruiz.
So that's really interesting. He's changed his style because he realized maybe he has a shaky chin. And he said, I need to be more defensive. I need to work the jab more. I need to brawl less. And it sounds like maybe he said, my team said to do this, but maybe that was a deliberate thought in his own head. And then when he opens up to go for the KO, that's when he gets dropped, and we all know what happened at the end of that fight. So what about Ruiz's style? When you're tracking the numbers, he's not a work the jab type of guy. He's more of a flurry Mexican style. What do you think about Ruiz's style?
Ruiz is your prototypical Mexican style fighter. He just happens to be one of the only Mexican heavyweights out there. I think Chris Arreola is one of the other ones, but he throws a lot of punches. He is different different than Tyson Fury. He's different than Deontay Wilder, and he's different than Anthony Joshua. He throws his hands a lot more, something in between 60 and 65 punches around. He goes to the body, too. That's something that we saw with in the Joshua fight. He hurt him to the body, got his attention, and then the head will fall. It's something that I talked to Ruiz about when we interviewed him last week at the fighter press conferences about, how are you going to get inside on Joshua, get inside on a bigger guy, because Andy Ruiz is not tall. He's maybe 5'10" on a good day. So he has to get inside. He's going to continue if he wants to keep winning. If he beats Joshua, he's probably going to fight Wilder or Tyson Fury. Those guys are monsters. They're huge. Andy Ruiz is 5'10", so you got to get inside and go to the body. But Andy Ruiz is kind of different than the three-headed monster that once was in the heavyweight division. That's Joshua, Wilder, and Fury. He throws his hands more. He's willing to trade. He has to get hit in order to hit the other guy, and we saw that against Joshua. He ate some huge punches. I think that not enough people are giving Ruiz enough credit for his chin. I mean, he weathered a huge storm there and then went on to knock out the heavyweight champion of the world, the gold medalist, Anthony Joshua. Man, this fight is, I feel like people are talking about it still. What's today? As we sit and we do this, today's Wednesday. It's almost 4 days after the fight. People are still talking about it. It's all over the internet. Every day there's a new meme. Every day there's a new Instagram thing. It's so good for the sport of boxing. I love you, Andy Ruiz.
So you talked about the three-headed monster in the heavyweight division that was Joshua, Wilder, and Fury. Now, I actually think what happened here was a good thing for boxing because now there's a four-headed monster. First of all, the rematch is going to be huge, massive, and other heavyweights have gone through this. Klitschko went through this getting knocked out. Lennox Lewis got knocked out. This has happened before, and they've come back to be great. So I think it's a good thing. How do you see Ruiz now in the mix, matching up against the Wilders of the world, the Furies of the world? We talked about him going to the body more. If he fights Fury, Fury can also move. And so that's two big guys moving. Now, Fury's got like a foot of height on him as well. How do you see him matching up against a Wilder or Fury? We know Wilder and Fury are fighting in January. They're going to have the rematch. But after that, it's going to be wide open for these heavyweights to clash. So how do you see Ruiz matching up?
Listen, Ruiz is going to make a fight exciting. Anthony Joshua doesn't really make fights exciting because he'll even say it doesn't, because look at the numbers. He throws a lot of jabs. Tyson Fury, he's not really an exciting fight, Tyson Fury. Let's be honest. He's, he'll gum you up in there. He'll hold you. He's like Hopkins, but in a heavyweight body. Deontay Wilder on the other end, goes out for destruction, and he's one of the most exciting fighters in boxing today. Andy Ruiz will always make exciting fights because of his style, his willingness to trade, his willingness to get punched. So, I'm thinking about fights with him and Wilder, which can easily be made for on a PBC. But, if Ruiz loses, even if Ruiz loses to Joshua in the rematch, I still think Wilder will fight Andy Ruiz because, let's be honest, the heavyweight division is very top heavy. I mean, there's not a lot of, viable opponents out there. Andy Ruiz now has entered his name into that pantheon of heavyweights. So I think that Andy Ruiz is like a breath of fresh air into the heavyweight division, a guy that throws a lot of punches. He's very soft-spoken. He's very marketable. Let's be honest, not New York, but the U.S., everyone's fat. So when you see Andy Ruiz walking around, and everyone they can relate to this guy because he's going out there as a 270-pound guy and knocking out guys that look like they are chiseled from stone.
It's a good time in the heavyweight division because Fury is like kind of that likable character. Wilder is outspoken. And now Ruiz, like you said, he's relatable. He's embracing it. He's saying, I do eat Snickers before each fight. So when you look at this fight and what happened, where do you rank this in terms of upsets in boxing? I mean, this is literally one of the biggest upsets in sports history, not just boxing history. You've been ringside for many fights, counting punches. Where do you rate this?
Oh, man. This has been the year of the upset in boxing. I know that 2018, the last fight of 2018 was Charlo against Harrison, and that wasn't, on the level of that. Then you see Andrew Cancio, what he did on DAZN, beating Machado, and that was huge. Go look at some of the other big upsets that have happened this year. But nothing on the scale of Andy Ruiz beating Joshua. I don't think it's up there with Tyson. I know Tyson Douglas, people are throwing that around because the casual fan will do that and they want to relate it to something. I don't think it's right at that level because Mike Tyson was just like unbeatable. And I think more people knew Mike Tyson. He was a killer than they know Anthony Joshua. And Buster Douglas was like a name. Like people knew Buster Douglas. Back then, boxing was a lot more popular. But people knew Buster Douglas. So I think Buster Douglas and Tyson is number one. I think that Rockman Lewis, I feel like is a close second. That was in South Africa, so not a lot of people were tuning in. But look at what happened with that. Lewis came back, knocked him out. I rank it, right there, third. Maybe, you can make a case, but the thing that makes this different than any other upset, Buster Douglas was in absolutely great shape for that fight with Mike Tyson. Rockman's a little on the pudgy side, but he was still built. Andy Ruiz went in at 270 pounds. Like, he had back cleavage. He just didn't care. He told everyone in interviews, I'm a chubby guy. I'm a chubby Mexican guy that eats Snickers. So when you factor that in, that's what got the imagination of the casual fan, got the imagination of everyone. My mom doesn't watch boxing. She knew that this was huge. When she took a look at Andy Ruiz and she took a look at at Joshua. So I think that's what makes this is people are going to remember this just from the, aesthetically wise.
He has the funny figure, but he actually is a hard worker. We've seen him in the gym doing a lot of conditioning work, moving well for a big man. So I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit here. We know that Joshua has triggered the rematch clause with Ruiz. We don't know where that fight's going to happen. Maybe the UK. Ruiz said he wants Mexico. We'll see what happens. If you had to make a pick right now on that rematch, we know Joshua's going to come in and be more defensive. Like you've been saying, he's already been trending in that direction of doing less power punches, more jabs, being more defensive. He's probably going to do that even more now. What's your official prediction? Joshua Ruiz 2.
I'm riding the bandwagon. I'm going with Ruiz strictly because Anthony Joshua has to think about this for the next 6 months. Every day, he's thinking about this. It's going to take over his thoughts. And if anything's true, I don't want to go into the rumors about, the anxiety or anything that happened beforehand, maybe getting knocked out in sparring. If he got knocked out in sparring, that's not good. That just shows you that this guy has, he's chinny. He is what he is. But I think that Ruiz is trending upwards. It's tough. It's really tough, but I like the way that Ruiz fights. I think he's fearless, and I think that even more pressure is going to be on Anthony Joshua in the rematch, especially if it's in the UK. There was a lot of pressure on him here in New York, in the US. I think that not enough people were talking about the amount of pressure that was on Anthony Joshua in a no-win fight, knowing that he had huge fights down the line. I think that all caught up to him. I think that when he was in that locker room and maybe he did get buzzed in sparring, maybe he started to have some doubts. I think that Andy Ruiz has no doubts. Andy Ruiz is still playing with house money right now. So if you had to ask me right now, I know it's a tough one, but I'll go with Ruiz.
Ruiz via knockout?
Yes. I mean, none of these fights are going to the cards. Only Tyson Fury, the type of guy that his style will bring fights to the scorecards. I think that Joshua and Ruiz are going to go after each other. They're going to seek and destroy each other. But I think that Ruiz has the better chin, and I also think that he has the mental edge over Joshua.
I think Joshua's going to make some adjustments, and I actually think him being chinny makes it a lot more exciting. It's like any defensive chinny fighter, like an Amir Khan or anyone else, it's like a man walking a tightrope, and it adds a special intrigue to every fight they're in because you say at any second something could happen to make this really exciting. So I think it's a really exciting time in the heavyweight division in boxing altogether, and looking forward to that rematch and Wilder Fury. I'm sure you are too.
Oh my God, this is great. I mean, everyone was looking past this fight as a replacement. This is just a stopgap till we get the fights that we really want to see. Everyone wants to see Wilder, Joshua. Then all of a sudden, this is what the beauty of boxing and the beauty of heavyweight boxing. You get something like Andy Ruiz comes through, and I've never seen anything like this. I've never seen the type of reaction that this fight is getting. Like, people are hitting me up that aren't boxing fans, asking me their thoughts on it. I did that interview with Andy Ruiz last week, and it's the numbers on YouTube are showing you that people are just searching this guy. This is a phenomenon, and it's because that he doesn't look like a heavyweight. People can relate to it, and like we just talked about earlier, it kind of breathes new life into the heavyweight division, which was already exciting to begin with. Now we have another player in there, a Mexican. Let's be honest. The Mexican fans in boxing are the best fans. They're the lifeblood of the sport. I've always said that. Throw a Mexican into this fray now. It's a four-headed monster. You also throw in Luis Ortiz. Also threw in Usyk. So right now, the heavyweight division was exciting, and it just got ratcheted up maybe tenfold now with Ruiz.
That's why we love boxing, the theater of the unexpected. Thank you, Dan, breaking it down ringside, counting stats. Thanks, Dan.
Thanks for having me.
That is why we love boxing. That was Dan Canobbio giving us his take. Next up, we have another unique perspective. We have Ed Mulholland. He is the ringside photographer. He's going to tell us how he works as a boxing ringside photographer and his thoughts of shooting and being at Joshua versus Ruiz.
I'm speaking with Ed Mulholland. He is the world famous boxing photographer, sports photographer. You can catch him ringside usually wearing a bright red Rutgers cap. It's very easily identifiable. You actually chose, Ed, you chose to go with the black cap this time, right?
I did. It shows up a little too much on TV sometimes. So I dialed it back a little for this fight. Yeah.
So this was obviously such a massive event, such a big fight. When you're preparing to shoot a fight like this, do you do anything differently knowing that the magnitude is this high?
You know what? It depends on the fight, but yeah, for something like this where you get this kind of magnitude with with like Joshua and anytime Anthony Joshua, or you get a fight like a Canelo and a Triple G or something of that, you're working on kind of a different scale. So for this, I had so for Matchroom, we had 3 photographers at the event. We had Mark Robinson, who's our UK photographer, was also on site, and Melina Pisano, who shoots second for me normally on other shows, was also there. So, I mean, we were running 3 photographers. We had 3 card runners. We had 2 photo editors, all on site. And then we were hanging remote cameras, covering dressing rooms. So, yeah, a lot of prep went into this one. Yeah.
And give me a little bit of idea of the gear that you have. I mean, how many cameras, how many lenses, what are you working with?
So for, a ringside shoot, I'm generally using 2 camera bodies, and I'll have 3 lenses. Generally I shoot with 2, but I might use a fisheye from time to time to get something a little bit different. But we also, for this, we did 2 remotes over the ring. Mark Robinson did one up in like the corner of the lighting truss, and it gives it an overhead in like a diamond type look. And I did one straight on from the main camera angle up in the lighting truss. So we had those 2 cameras. Mark had 2 cameras ringside. I had 2 cameras ringside. Melina was up top with 2 camera bodies, one shooting like a 400 millimeter lens tight, and another one doing some wide, like general views of the arena. So we had, what's that give us? Like 8 cameras around the ring for the main event. Yeah. Where normally if it were, just the 2 of us on, we'd have, 3 or 4 cameras. And, you're not generally doing remotes, things like that. But, something like this, it was just, all hands on deck and as many cameras as we could get. Yeah. It's pretty wild. I mean, it's just a whole different feel. I mean, like a big fight just has a different feel, and you want to get behind the scenes stuff and, just anything different you can get.
So you obviously had the fight well covered. When you were with these fighters during fight week, fighter meetings, press conferences, weigh-in, did you see anything from either Andy Ruiz or Anthony Joshua that made you think the fight was going to go the way it went?
No, I mean, and I don't have a lot of experience with AJ. This was the first fight of his that I actually photographed. But I've worked with him in the past, like at some press conferences. I was with him in Times Square for Klitschko. And when he fought Klitschko and he had a face on Times Square, and I did that for them. And, so I've been around him. But no, I mean, all fight week, he was absolutely perfect. And no issues whatsoever. Was really cooperative, in good spirits. And Andy Ruiz is just, I met him for the first time in his training camp when we were doing the promo shoot for the posters and stuff. And he's just such a level-headed, nice guy. And he was kind of the same way all fight week. I mean, it was just, as far as fighters go, it was actually pretty, they were pretty level-headed. I mean, calm. Yeah, there was nothing that would dictate one thing or another.
So in the 3rd round, Ruiz goes down and he somehow gets up and knocks down Joshua and takes control of the fight. Everyone in the arena, it was electric. They're losing their minds. For you, it's a little different. You can't celebrate at that moment. You can't take it in. You're probably concerned with getting the perfect shot and staying focused. Is it hard to maintain that focus when something like that is happening?
Yeah, I'm a boxing fan, so it is at times, but I've been doing it long enough where you kind of just go about your job. But I mean, it was strange. I mean, Joshua hit him with such a good combination. I mean, it was crisp. It was right on the chin. And, when he went down, his arms were kind of folded under him. And I mean, I remember it. And then, I mean, you still see it, but you're just doing your job and you're trying to frame stuff out. And he's such a good finisher. When Ruiz hit the canvas, I'm like, all right, here we go. And I couldn't even tell what happened after that because AJ's back was kind of, or Ruiz's back was kind of towards me, and I couldn't see what kind of punch actually hit him. I went back and watched it, I think on Monday, and I saw it was like a little hook that kind of got him behind the ear and just, sent his equilibrium all over the place, and that's the kind of punch that's really tough to recover from. But yeah, I mean, I will say at the end of that, and it's rare, but at the end of that third round, I just looked around the arena. I mean, everybody was standing. It was crazy. That was such a good building. It really was. The atmosphere was awesome and crazy round.
It was a crazy round. It was everyone's jaw was on the floor, and everyone was it was absolutely electric in the Garden. You had Joshua knocking down Ruiz, and then Ruiz by the end of it knocking down Joshua 4 times. I'm sure you probably like knockdowns because that can give you an interesting angle. It can get you a great shot. After the fight was over, you look back at all your work. Were there any specific moments or shots that you saw that really stood out?
Yeah, it's funny because like on a fight like this where we have runners and editors and things like that, I actually don't even see my stuff until the night's over. So it's pretty funny. I went back and it was I have a shot of Ruiz standing there like over Joshua from the third round. That is a really nice frame that the Boxing News in the UK just ran as a cover. I just thought I saw so many good images. I mean, not just for myself, but other people. Other photographers, just the celebration, like Ruiz's celebration was like so genuine. I mean, just him jumping around like, a kid in a candy store. It was, you don't get that all the time. And it was a lot of good photographs came out of that. And especially with Joshua standing in the background and Ruiz jumping all over the place. Those are probably the most memorable ones. The remotes, both Mark's remote and my remote, fired all night long. So we have some really nice stuff from above there. And it was good. It was, photographically all around, it was a really good night, but when I work, working for Matchroom, it took a little bit of the luster off it, but it was just a really good a really good fight to photograph. I mean, just action everywhere.
I'm not sure if you were in Joshua's locker room after or someone else was, but I just wanted to get, the psychology of sticking a camera in someone's face after one of the hardest moments of their life. Joshua was undefeated. He loses all his titles. What is that like for you when you're doing your job and you know that you have to get some type of locker room shots, you have to get something of seeing this guy defeated? Is that a challenge for you?
Yeah, you know what? We don't necessarily go into the locker rooms of the losing fighter after a fight. It's kind of like when you get, I'm not 100% in favor of it. When a guy gets knocked out and, you're sticking a microphone in his face at the end of a fight. And, obviously if it's a fight that was stopped or, a guy quits on his stool or something like that, it's a little different. But when a guy gets just, completely knocked out and, it's just, you try and be a little respectful. I mean, sometimes you have to go in there. And if you do, you just try and stay out of the way, and the fighter has a right to refuse you entry. The only dressing room I've really gone in after a fight, other than to get a champion who's just won with all their belts and stuff, is, I was in Gennady's locker room after the draw and, the first fight, and, he was cool. Not happy with the decision and all, but he was fine with us getting some photos and stuff of him. But for the most part, kind of try and stay out of a fighter's dressing room after the fight.
I could see Gennady being not too happy with that draw. I could see him being even more unhappy with losing the rematch by 1 point. So that's obviously got to be a tough assignment. When you look at this fight compared to all the great fights you've covered, shooting ringside, you've covered Gotti Ward, you covered the biggest Mayweather fights, the biggest Pacquiao fights, and on. Where do you rank this, just in terms of like we talked about, the energy in the arena, the magnitude of the moment, the heavyweight championship changing hands? Where do you rank this in your career?
You know what? It's always fun. It's it just happened. So it's like so fresh in your mind that you're like, oh my God, that's one of the best I've done. I think from an upset side of things, it's one of the biggest I've done. Nothing really comes to mind on that scale. I mean, I don't know if I'll ever do a fight that's better than the first Gotti Ward fight. So that's kind of got this permanent residency as number one on my list. Magnitude of the event, it was fantastic. I mean, I've done De La Hoya fights that felt like that. I've done, Mayweather Mosley that, had that like kind of electricity. This was up there. I mean, the crowd, the UK fans that came over, I mean, the building was loud. It's Madison Square Garden, so that right there lends to something. When you get a sold out Madison Square Garden, it's crazy. I mean, not a lot of fighters. I mean, really, not a lot of fighters come over and sell out the Garden. I mean, Cotto would sell out the Garden, but you don't get that often. And when you do, and then to have a fight deliver, and I know everyone expected the opposite result, but Andy Ruiz can fight, and it'll be interesting. It's I know a lot of people are upset about no, you don't get the Wilder fight, but I gotta tell you, Joshua Andy Ruiz 2 becomes a really, really big fight that people are gonna want to see. And we'll see where it ends up. But I mean, that night at the Garden was good. I mean, it's gotta be really high up there on my list of fights that I've shot, just because of the magnitude of it and what it was. And Joshua coming over here for the first time, and the fact that it was an upset. And I think if it had gone the other way, where even if it was going along the way it did, where he knocks Ruiz down, Ruiz knocks him down a couple times, and is winning the fight, and Joshua comes back and stops him, I don't know if it would hold the same significance that it will, because Joshua was supposed to win. But I think because it was such a big upset, it ranks pretty high up there. It's definitely one I'll remember.
It's definitely up there. The rematch is going to be even bigger. Ed Mulholland, you can catch him ringside at the biggest boxing events in the world, representing Rutgers on his cap. Ed, thanks a lot for the time and giving us a peek into your world there.
Thanks for having me. Really appreciate it.
Just a few more guests left. Next up is Lee Groves. If you've heard the name Lee Groves, that's because he is the boxing encyclopedia. He knows literally everything about boxing. And it was my pleasure to speak with Lee Groves about Joshua Ruiz.
Chatting with Lee Groves, boxing writer, boxing historian. Lee, I know you've written a lot about a lot of boxing. You've seen probably more fights than anyone that I could think of. When you look at Joshua Ruiz, take us through that event a little bit. Let's start from the beginning. Did you think that Ruiz had a chance to do anything close to what he did to Joshua?
I thought the fight would be competitive only because Ruiz, despite his physique, did have above average hand speed. He was kind of like a Buster Mathis Sr. in that respect. You can't judge a book by its cover, but I had no living idea that he would be able to overpower Joshua the way that he did. It was an enormous upset, and I know while I was watching it and watching Ruiz floor Joshua again and again and again, I was certainly yelling at my TV the way a lot of other people were.
when you knew about the matchup, obviously Anthony Joshua was supposed to fight Jarrell Big Baby Miller. Miller tested positive. Andy Ruiz is put in. What was your prediction before everything happened when you just heard Joshua versus Ruiz? What was your prediction at that time?
I thought that Joshua would score a mid-round TKO. When he became champion, Joshua was an exciting knockout artist. He was aggressive. He had, coming into the fight, Joshua had the highest knockout percentage of anyone who has held a widely recognized heavyweight championship. He was number one on the list. And I thought that, while Ruiz's hand speed might have required a couple of rounds of adjustment, I thought that big punch would eventually get to Ruiz in the middle rounds.
Ruiz's body type, I think, really dictated a lot of people's opinions about what he could do in the fight. He had an amateur background. He had over 100 wins in the amateurs. He'd been boxing for a long time. He was only one loss as a professional, and that was a very close fight against Joseph Parker. Many people thought he won that fight.
Right.
My question for you is, the way he looks, there's been training footage that has come out since. He's obviously a hard worker. So do you think the way he looks is that based on diet? His dad said he eats steak and some Snickers before every fight, and he's a heavyweight, so obviously he doesn't have to cut and make weight. Do you think his physique is natural, just genetic, and he's a hard worker, or is maybe the diet's not on place? What do you make of the way he looks?
I really can't say. It may be genetics, but it may well be genetics. But it's obvious that Andy Ruiz had talent. He had a boxing background. He has physical gifts. They're just not readily apparent once you look at him. But everyone who has watched him fight would say that yes, he is a talented fighter. But really, the physique is his best disguise. It definitely was, and that colored a lot of people's opinions as to his chances. Not only that, but the fact that he fought just 42 days earlier against Alexander Dimitrenko, who at 6'7" and he had similar height and reach to Anthony Joshua, and a somewhat similar physique to Anthony Joshua, and Andy Ruiz ran right through him. He scored a fifth-round TKO. Before the fight, I did some research about the shortest turnarounds for heavyweight title challengers before, in the last 50 years. And Andy Ruiz's 42 days was the fifth shortest turnaround for a heavyweight title challenger. And the four guys who had even shorter breaks between fights, they were all knocked out by the champion. And, you have Jeremy Williams. He fought 25 days before he fought Henry Akinwande, and he was knocked out in 3 rounds. Daniel Edward Neto of Argentina fought Francesco Damiani for the WBO title 35 days after his last fight. He was knocked out in 2 rounds. Obed Sullivan challenged Vitaly Klitschko 35 days, after his most previous fight, and he was knocked out at 9. And of course, famously, Burt Cooper fought Evander Holyfield just 36 days after his last fight, and he came the closest to scoring that victory when he hurt Holyfield, but Holyfield rallied and stopped him. So not only was Ruiz at a deficit in terms of body type, history was also working against him because he was a short notice opponent. And then you throw in the fact that this was Anthony Joshua's U.S. debut. It was highly celebrated. It was at the Mecca of boxing, Madison Square Garden. You know, he had deficits not only in body type, but in height and reach and punching power, supposedly. Andy Ruiz had a big mountain to climb, and to the world's astonishment, he conquered that mountain. And now look at where he is. Good for him. You know, good for him.
When you put it in that perspective, it's crazy to think he just came off of another fight and history was against him in that way. And like you said, it just makes it even more remarkable what he was able to pull off with his physique and his build that he has. Just in a historical sense, have there been other fighters who have looked like that and have had success? I mean, you know, the one name that obviously keeps coming up is Butterbean. I think Butterbean was over 400 pounds. I think he was a bigger man. And to my understanding, his specialty was shorter fights, 4-round fights, because he was a large man, but the stamina wasn't necessarily there. So were there, you know, in a historical sense, have there been people who have been successful who don't have a perfect body?
There have been. The one that comes to mind immediately was, of course, Buster Mathis Sr. His son, Buster Mathis Jr. He had some success. He didn't have the body beautiful, but for a couple of rounds against Mike Tyson, he performed pretty well until, of course, he got hit in the mouth by Mike Tyson, bringing up that famous saying, "Everyone has a plan until they get hit in the mouth." There are some fighters in history that do fit that pattern, and of course that's with the heavyweight division being what it is, it's unlimited poundage. You can go as far as your ability takes you.
With Joshua coming into this fight, I believe the punch stats comparisons of his previous fights show that he was actually trending towards throwing less power punches and more jabs, almost taking a more boxing approach, less brawling. And I think we've seen this in his previous fights. When he does hurt his opponent, though, he does open up and go for the kill. And usually, I think the 20-plus times that's happened in the past, his opponent is so out of it or doesn't have the will of an Andy Ruiz that they succumb to that and they get knocked out. That obviously was not the case on last Saturday night. Could you take us a little bit through that third round sequence where Joshua knocks down Ruiz and we're talking about the odds being stacked against Ruiz. At that moment, I mean, I don't think there was anyone who thought he could ever come back from that. Just take us through that moment and then what you saw in that third round.
What I saw in that third round was that Joshua nailed Ruiz with a perfect left hook to the jaw. It was short and compact. It drove Ruiz to the canvas. I thought at that point, okay, Andy fought a really good fight up until that point, but now the mountain is about to cave in on him. He got up, and when Joshua moved in for the kill, that's when Andy nailed him with a counterpunch. That's where his really good hand speed and his calm under duress kick came into play. When Joshua left himself open, Ruiz found the perfect punch to nail him and drive him to the canvas. And that's when, wow, I could not believe what I was seeing. And unlike Ruiz, who got up pretty clear-eyed, Joshua was genuinely hurt because the punches that put him down for the first time were high on the head. Where your temple is, where your equilibrium is. And really an argument could be made that Joshua never recovered from those two punches that put him down the first time. From that point, I remember going on Facebook after the third round knockdown, and I put down a note. It looks like Joshua just saw $100 million flash before his eyes. Like the phrase, your life flashing before your eyes. And really that kind of in retrospect, that kind of dovetails into the stat that you brought up, that Joshua had been fighting more cautiously in recent fights, as if he was protecting himself from a loss as opposed to gunning for the victory and being the exciting fighter that drew 90,000 people to Wembley, that drew 70,000 to Millennium Stadium. He was fighting not to lose, and he was trying to protect himself for the eventual big money fight, unification with Deontay Wilder. And he fought up until the point where he scored the knockdown against Ruiz. He was fighting cautiously, but then when he nailed Ruiz, he decided, okay, this is the time to cash in. And when he did, that's when the fight turned.
And certainly that Ruiz went down, he came up, knocked Joshua down, and it seemed like his equilibrium was off for the rest of the night. Yeah. Ruiz also capitalized on that and threw tons of combination punching. And I'm just wondering, from all the fighters that you've seen, looking at numbers, crunching numbers, combination punching like that at the heavyweight level, have you seen anything like that?
Power combinations. Mike Tyson was really good with throwing power combinations, throwing speed. Joe Louis was an excellent combination puncher. Evander Holyfield was a very good combination puncher, and of course, Floyd Patterson, Muhammad Ali. They were blessed with extremely good hand speed. There have been a number of heavyweights in history who have blended tremendous hand speed and foot speed with the size and the bulk.
And I think that still plays to the point that the reason it feels so remarkable is because none of them had the body type or build that Andy Ruiz did. And to see a big man move that way, to have those, that kind of combination punching is just astonishing. So the seventh round is when it ended. By the end of the night, Ruiz had actually knocked down Joshua 4 different times.
Yeah.
At the end of the fight, it's maybe a little bit of controversy. I think most people are pretty happy with the stoppage. Joshua's mouthpiece gets knocked out. And I guess my first question to you is, we all remember the famous shot of Mike Tyson trying to get his mouthpiece after being knocked down by Buster Douglas. What is the rule there with the mouthpiece? If Joshua says he's okay, but he doesn't have his mouthpiece in, is he allowed to continue? What is the exact rule at that moment?
The conventional way that the situation is handled is that the referee finds the mouthpiece, has it washed off by the corner man, and be reinserted in its mouth. It was a safety thing. But beginning with Diego Corrales against Jose Luis Castillo in 2007, I believe, Castillo or Corrales kind of took advantage of that conventional wisdom and gave himself additional time to recover by spitting out the mouthpiece and letting the corner wash off the mouthpiece and using the extra 15 to 20 seconds for additional recovery time. And because Corrales got away with it, other fighters started using this tactic whenever they get hurt. They know that the referee will stop the action and that therefore they would get more recovery time. And I kind of think that was what Joshua was hoping would happen with his mouthpiece. He was badly hurt. He sort of expected the referee to call timeout and have the mouthpiece washed off. But Michael Griffin was as aware of this history as their referees have gotten more wise to this tactic. And sometimes, from time to time, when they think that the fighter is sort of gaming the system, they allow the fight to continue without the mouthpiece. And I think Joshua was expecting one thing, and when that didn't happen, that caused the hesitancy in his actions. And that delay may have led to Griffin interpreting Joshua as not wanting to continue, even though he could be heard saying yes when asked if he wanted to still fight.
Wow, that's really interesting. So you're saying that it's a referee's discretion. He could just continue the fight and have one of the fighters not have a mouthpiece in?
I've seen it from time to time. It's not a hard and fast rule, but I do think that more often than not, the referee will stop and have the mouthpiece washed off and have it replaced. But I think I have seen referees, from time to time sort of interpret whether a fighter is purposefully spitting out the mouthpiece and spotting that, not give him what he wants.
Right. So more so if the referee feels like the fighter is doing it to buy time. So, at the end of the fight, like we said, the wave off is, most people are saying they're pretty happy with the way the stoppage happened. The referee asked Joshua, is he okay? Joshua said yes, but his body language wasn't great. He had his kind of arms on the ropes a little bit. And he looked slightly frustrated when the ref called it off. My question is, from a historical sense, the conventional wisdom is, if you are the champion, you should maybe get the benefit of the doubt. Have a chance to go out on your shield if you're going to be giving up all your titles. Has that been the way it's played out in the past in terms of the champion having that moment to go out on his shield versus the referee making a decision in big heavyweight championship fights in the past?
I think for the most part that has played out. It's sort of an extension to the old rule that back in the days before, around the 1970s, 1980s, in order for a champion to lose his championship, he almost had to be killed in order to lose his championship. And that truism has kind of faded over time. In that there's more of an emphasis of safety rather than letting a champion go out on his shield. It really goes from fight to fight, but if it's a really big fight, I kind of think that rule still is in effect, but less so than in previous years.
After the fight, Joshua went over to Ruiz. He was a good sport. He had a big smile on his face, congratulating him, giving him all the credit. Obviously, as boxing fans, their theories are everywhere. People are saying that Joshua had a panic attack in the locker room before the fight, something that he's denied. One thing that is true is that every single one of his fights up to this point was in the UK, and this was the first time fighting in America, fighting in New York. And that may not seem like a big deal, but there were changes made. He had different regulations about you couldn't have Gatorade in the locker room, maybe something that he's used to. His body clock, no matter who he is going to be different. It's just going to be a different routine. When you look at what happened on last Saturday night, do any of those things play a factor, you think, or was this just a case of Andy Ruiz stepping up to the plate and causing one of the biggest upsets in the history of boxing?
I think both things are correct. It was obvious that Anthony Joshua was not fighting in familiar territory. He wanted to make his mark in the United States, and there are things that you have to adjust to when you're fighting away from home. And, one fighter who was very sensitive to that kind of thing was Carl Froch. You have him in Nottingham, and Carl Froch was unbeatable. But you get him away from home, and he's somewhat of a different fighter. Although, he won away from home, but he's not the same fighter. Perhaps Joshua is the same way. So there were adjustments that he had to make, and but at the same time, Andy Ruiz, he was playing with house money. Nobody thought, very few people, I don't want to say nobody because there have been some people who have said, yes, I predicted that Andy Ruiz would win the fight, but they were in the vast minority. Virtually no one thought that Andy Ruiz would be able to do what he did. And he had the talent, the sense of opportunity, the timing, everything that he needed to take advantage of the situation that was before him. that I do think that both things are correct. That yes, Joshua may have been negatively affected by the change in scenery, but Andy Ruiz also took advantage of a once in a lifetime opportunity, or well, I guess in his case, a twice in a lifetime opportunity, since this was a second challenge for a championship. But this came out of the blue, and Andy Ruiz, God bless him, he did everything that he needed to do when the situation was presented before him.
If there were people who picked Andy Ruiz before the fight, I hope that they bought a betting ticket, because I'm sure that would have paid out quite nicely. When you look at the state of the heavyweight division now after this fight, I personally think it's actually much more interesting. I think there's a new player, and I think there's now 4 top guys, obviously Ruiz and Joshua, and then Wilder and Fury. And I think any of those guys fighting each other is interesting. As it is, Wilder and Fury have their matchup set for January or February of 2020. Right. Ruiz and Joshua are going to have a rematch.
Yeah.
What is your take on the heavyweight division, and what is your pick on the eventual Joshua Ruiz rematch and the Wilder Fury fight coming up?
Well, the heavyweight division in the post-Klitschko era is alive and well. There are a lot of people that criticize the Klitschkos for the way that they fought. They were very successful, they were very effective, and they were very dominant. I don't think that you could ask much more of a pair of heavyweight champions than Vladimir Klitschko and Vitaly Klitschko. They did their job, and they did their job well. And they were just so dominant that people were kind of bored with the heavyweight division. But then Tyson Fury came along and upset Vladimir Klitschko. And from that point forward, you have Wilder, now you have Ruiz, you have Jarrell Big Baby Miller. Despite the failed drug test, I don't know what his situation is going to be going forward. But if one person is kicking himself after what happened with Ruiz and Joshua, it's Jarrell Miller, because he is just as big as Joshua. He would have been heavier. He had just as much punch volume. He's probably as hard a hitter. There was an opportunity lost for Jarrell Miller. But, you have Dillian White. You have a whole host of great not just good fighters, but great characters that really kind of make the heavyweight division shine in a way that we haven't seen since the days of Lewis, Tyson, Holyfield, Morrison, Foreman. It's a very, very interesting weight class. As far as the rematch with Ruiz and Joshua, it's going to take place probably in England, overseas. They're going to have to pay him very well in order to have the 3-belt champion go to the opponent's home ground. But I'm sure that the money is going to be out there for him. Andy Ruiz, I heard, was installed as a 3-1 underdog in the rematch. Boy, I got to tell you, it's a very interesting fight, and I'm surely going to put a lot more thought into predicting this fight, the rematch, than I thought. Than I invested in predicting the first fight. It's very intriguing. Andy Ruiz showed a mental strength that many people didn't think that he had. He'll surely carry that mental strength into the rematch, because in Madison Square Garden, the first fight, the crowd was against him. There were a lot of Brits there cheering for him. And that's going to be the case in the rematch. But Andy Ruiz has shown himself to be a true player in the game. And, you can't count him out based on what he did in the first fight. If he could do it once, he can do it again.
I completely agree. I think it'll be who can make what adjustments.
Yes.
What will it be like if Joshua is fighting back in his hometown? Will he be back in his element? And what kind of defensive adjustments will he make? I also think the Wilder Fury rematch will be very interesting because, there's a conventional wisdom that a boxer / counterpuncher has the advantage in a rematch because he's learned more from his opponent versus, the one punch guy like a Wilder. But the fact that the second knockdown in that fight happened in the 12th round may have meant that Wilder actually found out how to get an opening. So I think that's also extremely interesting. I wanted to ask you from a historical sense, the way this is all playing out. As of right now, Andy Ruiz holds 3 of the belts, which he just got from Anthony Joshua, the WBA, the IBF, and the WBO. That third belt belongs to, that fourth belt, the WBC, belongs to Deontay Wilder. And then the lineal championship belongs to Tyson Fury. Like you mentioned, he outboxed Vladimir Klitschko.
Right.
My question for you is just from a historical sense, let's say, for example, Ruiz, the winner of Joshua Ruiz fights the winner of Fury Wilder. All the belts and the lineal championship on the line. Has that ever happened before where there was a heavyweight champion who had every single belt plus the lineal belts in recent memory?
Well, in the 4-belt era, I don't think so. But, really the concept of lineal champion is kind of frayed because if you go, there is no line that goes back to John L. Sullivan. There's no line that goes back to Gene Tunney or Rocky Marciano or, Muhammad Ali. It's more like the owner of the line of succession. And, right now, Tyson Fury, he's the man who beat the man who was the owner of the line of succession. You have fights in history like Tyson versus Spinks. Spinks was stripped of the IBF title because he chose to fight Jerry Cooney instead of fighting Tony Tucker, the IBF's #1 contender in the HBO heavyweight tournament. And, Tucker and Buster Douglas fought for the vacant belt. Tucker won it. Tyson knocked out Tucker to win the three widely recognized belts. And Spinks, because he hadn't been dethroned in the ring and because he beat the man who beat the man, which was Larry Holmes, they came into the fight with Tyson owning all of the alphabet belts, but Spinks being the man who beat the man. And that's why their particular bout in 1988 held so much historical significance. There is another fight in heavyweight history similar when Muhammad Ali and Joe Frazier fought in 1971. Muhammad Ali was stripped of his belts for not going into the military during the Vietnam War. He was the man who beat the man, Sonny Liston. And Joe Frazier and Jimmy Ellis, Ellis won the WBA heavyweight tournament, and Joe Frazier defeated Buster Mathis Sr. for the New York version of the title, the New York State Athletic Commission, which held very much power back then. And Ellis and Frazier fought for the alphabet belts. And Frazier knocked out Ellis in the 5th round in order to win that belt. But Joe Frazier wasn't seen to be the real heavyweight champion of the world until he met Muhammad Ali. And that's why that particular fight held such a terrific historical significance. It was 2 undefeated men with a legitimate claim to the heavyweight championship fighting each other. So that was a really unique set of circumstances. So yes, there have been times in which you have a guy with all of the hardware going up against a guy who had the mythology of the man who beat the man, fighting each other. And that's what if Tyson Fury, that's what Tyson Fury holds. He holds the mythical. His claim is mythical and not physical. And the man who has the 3 belts, Andy Ruiz, and if he gets the 4th belt against Wilder, eventually, the man who would have the 4 belts fighting Fury, that would be a similar circumstance.
Right. It's a very interesting time because you have Ruiz versus Joshua set up and you have Wilder Fury ready to go.
Yeah.
So in theory, if Wilder beats Fury, he has not only the WBC, but then he has that mythical lineal championship, like you said, or vice versa. Fury could have those. Same thing going with the Ruiz-Joshua winner. They have those 3 belts. So it's almost like it's an exciting time in the heavyweight division because we're almost one step away from that absolute unified, undisputed lineal champion. And so it's a very interesting and exciting time. So just to wrap it all up, there's obviously been so many upsets in boxing history, but this is definitely in the top of the list. The names Mike Tyson versus Buster Douglas has, of course, come up. Lennox Lewis' first fight against Hasim Rahman has come up. So where do you rank Andy Ruiz's huge upset win against Anthony Joshua in a historical sense?
Well, I remember in the first blush of seeing what I had just seen, I went on Facebook and I asked, is Ruiz-Joshua a bigger heavyweight championship upset than Douglas-Tyson? And for the reasons that I had listed earlier, a case could be made for it. But, upon further reflection, I believe that it belongs in the top 10, maybe the lower end of the top 10. Of course, Douglas-Tyson ranks number 1 just for the sheer shock value of it. Mike Tyson was the baddest man on the planet. He was 38-0. He was defending his championship for the 10th time. He was seen as an unbelievable, indestructible force of nature going up against a man who had a history of not fulfilling his potential. And of course, we all know what happened. Tyson wasn't exactly in the best of shape. He was dropped by Greg Page in a public sparring session shortly before the fight. Douglas was coming into the fight in the best shape of his life, one it's in a lifetime shape. He also had the height and reach advantage, and he had the skills to know how to use them. It was just a whole perfect storm of circumstances that led to that historic upset. But there have been others in history that have shook up the world. For instance, Leon Spinks fighting Muhammad Ali for the first time, an 8-fight pro or a 7-fight pro going up against the absolute legend Muhammad Ali, an aging one, but still a prohibitive favorite. And Leon Spinks shook up the world by defeating him by a split decision, which I think should have been unanimous. There are others in history, such as the first Holyfield-Mike Tyson fight. I remember a story before that fight that a cable company, Mike Tyson was such a prohibitive favorite against Evander Holyfield at the time. It opened up as a 25-1 fight. That one cable company tried to have a pay-per-round format in that they thought that Tyson was going to destroy Holyfield in such short order that in order to have people who paid for the fight not feel that they were cheated, it would be $5 per round that the main event lasted. So if the fight had gone 1 round, it would only be worth $5. 2 rounds for $10, 15 for 3, up until $50. And that cable company was not allowed to do that. But the fight went 11 rounds, and Holyfield was such an earth-shaking upset. This was at the time in which there were questions surrounding the state of Holyfield's heart. They thought that he not his courage, but his actual physical heart. There were some people that thought he was going to die in the ring, but that was another massive surprise. Others that come to mind include George Foreman, 45-year-old George Foreman, knocking out with one punch a 20-something Michael Moorer to become the heavyweight champion 20 years after he initially lost the championship to Muhammad Ali. Other ones are Lennox Lewis's twin defeats to Hasim Rahman and Oliver McCall. Corey Sanders' knockout of Vladimir Klitschko in 2 rounds was a major surprise. If you want to go back a little farther in history, in 1935, Max Baer lost his championship to the Cinderella Man, James J. Braddock, and Cassius Clay knocking out Sonny Liston in the seventh round. And here's another one that's kind of forgotten. Michael Bent fighting Tommy Morrison for the WBO heavyweight title. For Morrison, it was supposed to be a tune-up for a future unification showdown with Lennox Lewis. I think that Morrison stood to make $8 million if he had beaten Michael Bent. But Michael Bent scores 3 knockdowns before Morrison's home fans in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and wins the WBO championship in 1 round. That was an unbelievable upset. And then, of course, Muhammad Ali's Rumble in the Jungle upset against George Foreman. People recall that George Foreman not only beat the 2 men that had beaten Muhammad Ali, but he knocked them out in 2 rounds, Joe Frazier and Ken Norton. And, there were some people that were questioning not whether Ali would win or lose, but whether he would live or die. Foreman was that much of a monster. And you could say that Ali's victory over Foreman was an even bigger upset than the one against Liston, because against Liston, Ali was the bigger, the taller, the rangier, the younger, the faster fighter. And against Foreman, he was 10 years older than he was then. He was fighting a bigger, stronger, heavier hitting version of Sonny Liston. He was younger on top of that. And like I said before, he defeated the 2 men that beat Muhammad Ali in very short order. And for Ali to do what he did and to win by a knockout on top of everything else, it was an amazing twist of fate in heavyweight championship history. So, yes, there have been some really good upsets over the years, and I think that Ruiz-Joshua fits into the top 10, but maybe in the lower end of the top 10, considering that Joshua was considered a bit chinny. He went down against Vladimir Klitschko, and that he had fought more cautiously in recent fights, sort of setting a stage of vulnerability, potential vulnerability down the line, but not against a guy like Andy Ruiz. It was a surprise that Ruiz was the one who cashed in. But there was a little bit of question surrounding Anthony Joshua going into the fight.
Wow, that's really great stuff. And if anyone wants to know more about Michael Bent's story, there's a great documentary on Netflix called Losers, telling his journey. He was knocked out in his first fight and then his comeback. And it's a great story. And also, I think that pricing model you mentioned is very interesting. I think, It's funny nowadays as boxing fans, we're getting ready to get new subscription models and there's different pricing. I think a per round pricing model could maybe work in today's day and age. But that's great information, Lee. And I think the best thing to take from all that is that we were lucky enough to witness a fight in recent memory that is at least in the conversation of all the other great upsets that you brought up. So, Lee Groves, you are the boxing historian. You may be the absolute boxing historian, a brilliant author. Thank you so much for the time, and thanks for putting everything we saw with Joshua Ruiz into a historical perspective. Thanks so much.
Thanks for the opportunity. Thanks for reaching out to me, and it was a pleasure speaking with you. You know me. If you want to talk boxing history, I'll talk boxing history at the drop of a hat, and I will hang in as many rounds as necessary.
Yes, sir. Thanks so much, Lee. I'll talk to you soon.
All right. Thank you.
Lee Groves can certainly go rounds. Another guy who can go rounds is Corey Erdman. He is our final guest, and he is up next.
I am speaking with Corey Erdman. He's a boxing commentator, a writer, a historian who works behind the scenes with The Zone. Corey, you were at the Garden last Saturday. We all witnessed the insane upset win by Andy Ruiz versus Anthony Joshua. It was shocking. Let me ask you this. Going into that fight, did you think Ruiz had a chance?
I didn't, and I feel bad for having thought that, because in retrospect, and of course it's easy to look back and kind of reason with the results and study the results and find reasons why we should have thought something different, when something unexpected happens. But really, looking back at it, the only reason I felt that way was just because of the way that Andy Ruiz looked. And that's unfair. And really, when we're looking at it and the reaction to what happened and why people are so surprised, it's all down to optics. And I wrote about this for Boxing Scene the other day. But if Andy Ruiz looked like your standard fare heavyweight, and he had abs, and he was just a regular 6'2" heavyweight, if he had the same build but his musculature was a little bit different, I don't think we would be thinking about this the same way. And I don't even think that the odds necessarily would have been made the same way either. I think that this kind of came down to looking at a guy who didn't look like he was supposed to be a top-level athlete, much less a top-flight heavyweight. And we kind of made the assumptions from there. And so, I've kind of had to wrestle with that, in retrospect, because we should have at least given him a chance, even if we didn't think he was going to win the fight.
Right. We knew his amateur background, over 100 amateur wins. We know the resume he's had. He had a very close fight with Joseph Parker in Parker's hometown, and a lot of people think that Ruiz actually won that fight. So we knew what he was capable of. And I think you're right. If he looked differently, we would have all been looking at this matchup differently. But I think it was the fact that he looked the way he looked, and he's also colorful, and he's playing into that persona. He has the Snickers everywhere he goes. He's making light of it. So I think that all played into it, and it was almost the perfect storm of, and he was a late replacement for Big Baby Miller. So I think it was all of that for all of us to kind of overlook that this was even possible. So let me ask you, we're talking about his physique. I've seen videos now popping up of him in the gym. He can actually move for a big man. And we know, reports are coming out that he's always been a hard worker. He trains hard. He's been boxing for a long time since he was a kid. So the muscle memory's there. Why does he look the way he looks? If he's training hard, why does he kind of look that way?
Well, I do not have a medical background, so I can't explain it, but I can, in general terms, explain it by just saying that people are built differently. And, I challenge anyone who is still sitting at home kind of giggling about the way that Andy Ruiz looks to go and not forget trying to fight Andy Ruiz. Obviously, Andy Ruiz would knock virtually everyone in the world out, but go try and beat Andy Ruiz at any kind of thing in the gym. Because as you mentioned, we've now seen some of the kind of strength and conditioning circuits that the guy does. Clearly, the guy runs every single day of his life. So, go out and do anything in the gym or outside conditioning-wise and see if you can keep up with Andy Ruiz. I think the bottom line is this is a guy who, wasn't blessed with the kind of body that, say, Anthony Joshua was blessed with, but he works extremely hard, and maybe he, eats a few more calories than he burns sometimes, but I think ultimately he started behind the 8 ball with not necessarily the ideal physique or the ideal metabolism. But in terms of athleticism, he's right there with anyone else. You wouldn't say that, linemen in football aren't athletic. We all understand that those guys are phenomenal athletes. But if we see a boxer enter the ring looking any way other than basically a pro wrestler or a bodybuilder would look, we immediately assume they don't know what they're doing. And obviously, this was the perfect illustration of why that's not true.
Yeah, I think it was, he said his father used to give him a steak and Snickers before every fight. So when you hear stories like that, you see someone who looks the way they look, you're going to think a certain thing. So let's look at the fight a little bit. You know, but we're obviously going to get to the knockdowns and the upset, but early on, round one, round two, Joshua has been known to actually be someone who feels out his opponents. He's not like Wilder, where he's necessarily going for the kill right away, just trying to land a right hand. He does feel out his opponents from time to time. Did round one, round two, did you see anything, or was it kind of going the way you expected it to go?
Well, even before round one, there just seemed like there was something off about Anthony Joshua. And, we were kind of hearing whispers because you and I were at the fight and we were standing beside one another watching the fight. But people in and around the fight had heard whispers all week from Eddie Hearn talking about, and they weren't premeditated excuses, but he was talking about how things were different for AJ leading up to this fight because he had commitments, he had more press to do, he had to kind of travel around the city and make all those TV hits. And then when he got to his locker room, the New York State Athletic Commission allows or doesn't allow certain things that AJ and other fighters might be used to. I think, for example, he couldn't have Gatorade in the locker room. Andy Ruiz couldn't have a Snickers bar either, so I guess it's fair game. But they were like, so you heard that, and then when it comes time for Joshua to enter the ring, he's late coming out for his entrance. When he comes out, he doesn't seem all that jacked up to be in MSG, even though the crowd's going wild. And then during his introductions, he just kind of slumped in the corner and chewing on his mouthpiece a little bit. And I just got the sense that for whatever reason, Joshua, his temperament wasn't the same that I had seen it in the past. And even in rounds 1 and 2, he just looked a little bit, I don't want to say lethargic, but a little bit more laid back in the ring in rounds 1 and 2, and certainly even throughout the fight, even after he got hurt. But I got the sense in rounds 1 and 2 that he was behaving a little bit differently, and I chalked it up to maybe him thinking, well, this isn't going to be a challenge, so I didn't think anything of it. But then, as I'm sure we're going to get to, then round 3 happens, and then you start to re-ask those questions all over.
And yeah, we'll get to that in one sec. But do you think that the reason for that was, he's fought, Anthony Joshua, that is, has fought every single fight in the UK. That's his comfort zone. This is his first time fighting in America, fighting in New York. His whole routine is off. His body clock is off. And not to give him excuses, but that has to make a difference when you've done something every single time, 20 plus times the exact same way and had success with it. And now you're making that change. That has to make a difference. Do you think it was that, or do you think it was like the stuff we've been talking about, looking at his opponent? It's a late opponent. It's someone they brought in late. Who, he's obviously going to not put his best work in training camp because he may be overlooking this guy a little bit. Do you think it's one or the other, or do you think it's a little bit of both?
I think it could be a combination of a lot of things. It could be none of the things. I mean, if you're looking for reasons why, I think that, as you just pointed out, like, there are lots of directions that you can point, and one of them may be the unfamiliarity, like, with the environment. But, Andy Ruiz is from California. Although it's not quite as drastic, he's switching time zones too to come to the fight. As we mentioned, all the added commitments that AJ had, his training camp, as you mentioned, with the opponent change, really, I mean, this was kind of the third opponent that he was preparing for at different times. First it was Jarrell Miller. Then for a while we really thought it was going to be Luis Ortiz, and he probably was starting to think about how to fight King Kong, and then ultimately has to fight Andy Ruiz. So I'm sure that wasn't ideal for him. And then everything on fight day being a little bit different. Listen, I think that combined with maybe not thinking that Ruiz was as serious a challenger as he was, if you put those things together, that could definitely be a formula that would create a fighter that looked as off as Joshua did in the ring. But, I mean, only Anthony Joshua could tell you, and everything that he's putting out there now is suggesting that he was 100%, everything was fine, and he just lost. So, I mean, those are his words, but if we couldn't speculate, I don't know that we'd have a job. So let's just keep it up.
there's definitely a lot of speculation out there. There was speculation that he had a panic attack before he went out, which he denied. And he's done a good job of not making excuses and basically saying that he just needs to do better next time, which I think is good for him and also good to give credit to Andy Ruiz for what he did. So round 3, Anthony Joshua knocks down Ruiz. It's almost how everyone expected it to go, and you expect Anthony Joshua to now go for the finish as he's used to doing. He opens up, and Ruiz had other plans. So my question for you is, when Ruiz came back right there, getting up off the canvas and knocking down Joshua so quickly, what was your reaction at that moment? And also, when else have you seen that in a fight? You see guys trade knockdowns, but very rarely is it at that stage and so immediate one after the other.
Yeah, well, I mean, my reaction was, it's a shock when you start physically grabbing people around you. Like, I remember grabbing Adnan Virk and kind of like hustling over to you and Sugar Ray at that point. And like, that something incredible is happening when you feel the need to embrace other people around you. So I was definitely shocked. But it pointed to a weakness that Joshua has, and that's that if you punch with him, you can have a lot of success. And Ruiz said, even going into the fight, that was going to be his game plan. And the moment he got knocked down, Joshua kind of inadvertently walked himself into a position where he wasn't going to be successful. In going for the kill, he walked himself into an area where Ruiz was going to beat him every single time, and that's on the inside, because Andy Ruiz has faster hands. He's going to beat him to the punch. Through no fault of his own, he did what you should do once you knock a guy down the way that you knocked him out. The way that he had knocked him down with that left hook is go and try and finish the fight. But he also walked into a world of danger that ultimately he never really recovered from.
And no, I completely agree. And to the second part of the question, have you seen that in other fights that you can remember?
I mean, I'm sure I have. I'm trying to think of an instance where it happened so immediately. Where I guess if you look back at like Prince Nassim and Kevin Kelly, the 4th round, I believe, Kelly scores a knockdown on Naz. It was a knockdown basically because his glove touches the canvas. But you still, even in that moment, knew that Naz was the one who was in control. And it didn't take long for him to close the show then thereafter. I mean, that was a little bit of a different kind of fight because Naz got floored early, and so the momentum kind of swung a couple times. But it was definitely round 3 of Joshua and Ruiz was definitely one of the more dramatic rounds that we've seen in recent memory. And even if I do lose my brain and think of others, I think they're few and far between.
No, absolutely. I mean, a couple of things that came to mind for me was Sergio Martinez and Paul Williams in their first fight traded knockdowns. I think it was in round 1. Andre Berto and Victor Ortiz in their first fight traded knockdowns. But again, a lot of these there was moments in between. It's hard to remember when it was so immediate and the fight was going so much the way we expected. It's almost as if, a few weeks ago when Brazil got knocked down by Wilder, if he ended up somehow getting up and knocking down Wilder, it would have been that level of shock.
Exactly. Yeah, I think that was what was spectacular about it, was that Ruiz nearly ended the fight immediately after. Give that 10 more seconds, and that doesn't make it to the 7th round. That fight ends in the 3rd round. I was watching a fight last night. If we're going to get super obscure, a WBA featherweight title fight from '96 between Young Soo Choi and Orlando Soto. And in, I believe, the 3rd round of that fight, Choi gets floored really hard twice. But by the end of the round, he's desperately hurting Soto, but he doesn't score a knockdown in that round. So again, I think that this was very much an outlier in terms of boxing. There aren't too many instances that are quite like that.
Completely agree. So it looked like the first time Ruiz knocked down Joshua, he landed a punch either behind Joshua's ear or near his ear, almost like temple shot that just kind of took everything out of Joshua. He was never the same after that. My question is, a lot of people are saying now that Joshua had a shaky chin. We've seen him get wobbled before. But does he have a shaky chin, or is it a temple shot? Anyone can get hit with a temple shot and kind of lose the wits about them for a few rounds.
Yeah, I mean, I think also, if we're talking about shaky chins, like, who in the heavyweight division near the top has an iron chin? Like, if you look at the top 10, all of those guys have either been floored hard, buzzed seriously, knocked out completely. That's just heavyweight boxing. And also, he got up from all 4 knockdowns. So, being susceptible to being knocked down, I think, is different than being chinny, where kind of at any point you can get completely flattened. Joshua perhaps could have fought on after the 7th round. I'm not saying it wasn't the correct decision to end that fight. It most certainly was. But this is a guy who can take these shots and either continue or at least recover from them and get back to his feet. So I don't know. I hate putting labels like that on fighters, because you start going down this road of just demeaning these guys who are obviously spectacular athletes and who are obviously spectacularly tough, and anyone can be knocked out. And when you use the term chinny with someone, it kind of denotes that they're fragile in some way. And I think that Anthony Joshua is anything but fragile.
No, absolutely not. So on that 7th round, Ruiz knocks him down a couple times. The first time in that round, I believe it was, Joshua got up and kind of smiled at Ruiz. I don't know if that meant, what he was trying to say there. I mean, there's been speculation that he had a concussion at that point. Then he's knocked down again, and the ref asks him if he's okay. He says yes, but the referee did not like his body language. There's been talk about, was it an early stoppage? Was it not? What do you make of the stoppage of that fight?
I mean, I most certainly do not think it was an early stoppage. I mean, if anything, Joshua got extra time to contemplate what he was doing, and Michael Griffin took extra time to make sure that he was making the correct decision on a stage of this magnitude. And, keep in mind, Michael Griffin is, I consider, a wonderful referee. I've had some great discussions with him about the philosophies of officiating, and I've always known him to be someone who errs on the side of the safety of fighters. And so I really, but at the same time, I think has been fair in other instances where people have criticized him for giving guys too much of a chance. So I think that he is a very, very good, perceptive referee, and I agree with the stoppage. Going back to what you said about the smile after that 3rd knockdown, that again points to what I was talking about in terms of Joshua's behavior just being odd the whole night. He just looked, too relaxed for the moment. And whatever that reason was, you're getting knocked down the 3rd time, you're still smiling, even after the fight. And the sportsmanship that he showed, is commendable. And really, what are you going to say that could be negative about that? That's how we want athletes to behave, even though you shouldn't fault them for being angry either. But even after he loses the biggest fight of his life, one of the biggest upsets in recent memory, he's still smiling and hugging his opponents and seems okay with everything. So I don't know. It just, there are a lot of arrows towards bizarre behavior on Joshua's part throughout the night.
It's a tough line for him that he has to toe, because as soon as the referee stops it, he says, "What?" And you see him, that's his protest. But a few moments later, he has a big smile on his face and he's congratulating Ruiz. So it's a tough situation for him, because in one hand, if he's arguing, then he looks like a poor sport. But if he's not, and he is, congratulating Ruiz and has a big smile on his face, people are maybe questioning his toughness, how badly he wants to be there. And so it's a tough situation for him. When you look at, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, there was an interview with Joshua. I forget what it was, but it was sometime recently. But someone pointed out that Joshua, after the Klitschko fight, said something to the degree of, "I don't want to be in a fight like that anymore." And people are kind of pointing to that as, a possible indication that Joshua doesn't have the heart to be in boxing. But if that were the case, he wouldn't have got off the canvas all 4 times. So I don't necessarily think that that's fair. And, I'm not a psychologist either, but what I can tell from studying Anthony Joshua and watching him throughout the years is that he does seem like a man who is very comfortable with himself, and he seems to be very comfortable with his life as well. And a lot of people are using these lines like, oh, you made a lot of money, you sleep in silk pajamas, how can you get up and do road work in the morning, that kind of thing. I don't even think it's necessarily that, but Joshua seems pretty content with the life that he has. To my knowledge, he still lives in a room at his mom's house. He posted a video of this apartment that he was renting, and it's kind of like something most of us could afford, with like the couch is torn up, but it does not look like a place befitting of a heavyweight champion. So he just seems like a guy who's fairly content. So that seems to fall in line with his behavior afterwards, being like, all right, well, I lost this fight, but in the grand scheme of things, everything is pretty okay for me right now.
Absolutely. Joshua saying that after the Klitschko fight is vastly different than, for example, Victor Ortiz saying, I don't deserve to be getting hit like this after a Marcos Maidana fight. They're very different things. So when you look at this fight, and we've had a few days to digest and take it in, where do you rank it historically in terms of the biggest upsets? I think as soon as the fight ended, we looked at each other and I think we said Tyson Douglas ? Where do you rank this in terms of the biggest fights in boxing, the biggest upsets in boxing? What is your take?
Well, I don't know that it necessarily ranks with some of the biggest upsets because, there are a lot of fights that go on. There have been 200 years of fights, and there are fights every week, and sometimes guys pull really wild upsets, last-minute opponents on undercards and whatnot where the odds might be greater than they were in this case. Ruiz closed out as an 11-1 underdog, which is big, but it's not 42-1 in terms of Buster Douglas, or I can't remember what the odds would have been for, Jim Braddock against Max Baer. But I think in terms of when you consider the stage, I think that it was one of the more shocking moments in recent boxing history. I think that's how I would categorize it, because I don't think it's quite Douglas-Tyson, certainly not qualitatively, because we know the differential in the odds there. And we also know the difference in terms of Tyson's mystique and Anthony Joshua's mystique heading into each fight. So I don't know necessarily where I would rank it, because I think that can be more accurately assessed by actually looking at the betting odds. But if you consider, again, the stage and the stakes, and again, the optics of what it looked like to see a guy who looks like Andy Ruiz knock out a guy who looks like Anthony Joshua, it was one of the more stunning moments that maybe we'll ever see in boxing.
Absolutely. It's definitely in recent memory, it's one of the most shocking things in not just boxing, but in sports. Just to wrap it up, looking ahead here a little bit, Joshua has triggered his rematch clause. The rematch is going to happen. We don't know where yet. Ruiz has mentioned Mexico. I'm sure Joshua would love it in the UK. On the other side of the table, Wilder and Fury are set for their rematch at the beginning of next year. I actually think this is a good thing for boxing. I think it's a good thing for the zone. I think instead of 3 big players in the heavyweight division, I think there's now 4, and any of them fighting each other is extremely interesting. What is your take about the heavyweight division now, and what would be your pick on the Joshua Ruiz rematch?
I know that Joshua will be favored, and in fact, he already is favored in the lines that have been opened. But I don't know that after what I saw and what I have seen that I could pick against Andy Ruiz in the rematch. I would pick him to do it again, because it didn't seem to me, even considering all of these things that felt off about Anthony Joshua, it didn't seem to me that was a fluke. It seemed to me that was a guy with a style to thwart Anthony Joshua most of the time. Now, clearly Joshua could still punch, and maybe he lands that same shot that he lands in the 3rd round of this past fight, and Ruiz doesn't get up. But if I'm playing the percentages, I would probably pick Ruiz. And I think you're right. I think it's great that suddenly there are 4 heavyweights out there. And I know people are upset that they felt that this spoiled Joshua versus Wilder. And, I understand that mindset because, you felt like you were robbed of what would have been, a major spectacle, getting those guys in the ring together at a particular time. But ultimately, this isn't pro wrestling. We can't kind of bemoan things and say, like, it's not like, how did they let Brock Lesnar beat The Undertaker? It should have been someone else to beat him. That's basically what we're saying here. We saw Anthony Joshua conquered, but we wish that it were Deontay Wilder who had done it because it would have been in some way more satisfying for us. When in reality, what we're watching is a sport, and we are watching people climb the ladder to be determined the best fighter in the world. And someone beat Anthony Joshua. So now there's another guy who's in that conversation who right now has claim to the heavyweight throne. And what we should be watching for is finding out who the best fighter is, and not, you can't. What you can't do is get mad at promoters for marinating and wanting to build up big fights, and then get pissed off when and start like basically being an armchair booker and hoping and wishing that it were another guy in the ring with Anthony Joshua. You can't have it both ways. And I think that we should appreciate the enormity of what just happened and appreciate the new landscape that we have.
I completely agree. This isn't Mayweather-Pacquiao taking years to come together to fight. This was one guy who imposed his will and shocked the world, and he looks the way he looks, like we said, with the optics, and that causes the sports world to take notice, the mainstream world to take notice, and that's definitely a good thing for boxing. Corey, thanks a lot for your time and your insight. Appreciate it, and I'll talk to you soon.
Anytime, man. We'll see you in a bit.
If you made it this far, thank you. I hope you enjoyed our show. You can find me on Twitter at Curran Bhatia, CurranBhatia, and you can follow the podcast at our Twitter handle at ATE_podcast. ATE_podcast on Twitter. Please give us a follow, share with your friends. This is Curran Bhatia. This was the Ask the Experts podcast. We broke down Joshua Ruiz. I don't think you could break it down any more than we did. We had some great guests. I hope you enjoyed the show. Hope to hear from you again very soon. Thank you once again. My name is Curran Bhatia, and I am signing off for the Ask the Experts podcast.